Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. 23 years on the force teaches you to read people. You learn to spot the liars, the ones hiding something, the desperate ones who'll do anything to protect their secrets. But nothing prepared me for what happened in Maple Heights during the fall of 2019. Nothing prepared any of us for what we found when the Neighborhood Watch program started reporting their findings. My name is Officer Thomas McCarthy. I work patrol for the 47th Precinct in the Northeast Bronx. Been walking beats and answering calls since 1996. Seen everything from domestic violence to gang shootings, drug busts to missing persons. You think you've seen it all until you haven't. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember because the leaves were just starting to turn. That crisp smell in the air that reminds you winter's coming whether you're ready or not. I was partnered with Officer Jennifer Walsh that day, good cop, 15 years experience, the kind of partner you want watching your back when things go sideways. Dispatch crackled over the radio around 9:47 a.m. Unit 2-3, respond to 847 Maple Heights Avenue. Caller reports suspicious activity, possible breaking and entering. Caller identifies as Robert Miller, Neighborhood Watch Coordinator. Walsh keyed the mic. 2-3 responding, ETA 8 minutes. Maple Heights was one of those middle-class neighborhoods that had been gentrifying over the past decade. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained houses, the kind of place where people actually knew their neighbors' names. It was also the kind of place where a strong neighborhood watch program made sense. Low crime, engaged residents, people who cared about property values. We pulled up to find Robert Miller waiting on the sidewalk. Mid-50s, glasses, wearing a windbreaker with Neighborhood Watch Coordinator embroidered on the chest. He had that eager look civilians get when they think they've caught something important. "Officers, thank you for coming so quickly," he said, approaching our unit. "I've been observing some very concerning activity at the Henderson place." He pointed to a 2-story colonial across the street. "The family's been away on vacation for 2 weeks, left last Monday. But I've been seeing lights, movement in the windows. Someone's definitely inside." Walsh and I exchanged glances. Standard breaking and entering call, probably kids or squatters, but we follow protocol. "When did you first notice the activity, Mr. Miller?" I asked, pulling out my notepad. 3 days ago, I keep a log, you understand. Part of our watch program. Tuesday night around 11 p.m., I saw a light in the upstairs bedroom, just for a few minutes. Then Wednesday, same thing. Last night I decided to call it in." "You're certain the family is away?" "Absolutely. I spoke with Patricia Henderson myself before they left. Family vacation to Florida, 2 weeks. I've been collecting their mail, watering the plants. They're not due back until this coming Sunday." Walsh nodded. "We'll take a look. You should probably wait in your house while we investigate." The Henderson property looked quiet from the outside. No vehicles in the driveway, newspapers piling up despite Miller's mail collection, that empty look houses get when no one's home. But something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. We approached the front door. Standard procedure: knock and announce, check for signs of forced entry, listen for movement inside. The door was locked, no scratches around the deadbolt, windows intact. But when I pressed my ear to the door, I heard something. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate. moving across what sounded like hardwood floors. Walsh heard it too. She unclipped her radio. 2 to 3 to Central, we have confirmed movement inside the residence. Requesting backup for forced entry. Copy 2 to 3. Backup unit 2 to 7 en route. We waited. Protocol dictates you don't enter alone unless there's immediate danger. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was something else. A sound I couldn't immediately identify. Rhythmic, like tapping. Unit 2-7 arrived 5 minutes later. Officers David Thompson and Mary Rodriguez, both solid cops. Thompson had his 20 years in. Rodriguez was newer, but sharp. We briefed them quickly. Henderson family's away. Neighbor reports lights and movement for 3 days. We've confirmed someone's inside. Rodriguez checked her gear. Any weapons calls from this address? Outstanding warrants. Clean address. Family's got no record. Thompson approached the front door, tested the handle. Still locked. Back door? We circled around. The backyard was enclosed by a 6-foot privacy fence, well-maintained lawn, children's swing set. The back door was also locked, but here we found our first real evidence of intrusion. Fresh scratches around the deadbolt, tiny metal shavings on the ground. Someone had picked or forced the lock. There's our entry point, Walsh said. Let's call it in. I radioed dispatch while Thompson and Rodriguez positioned themselves. Standard forced entry protocol for suspected burglary. Announce police presence, give occupants opportunity to surrender, then breach if no response. Police, this is the NYPD. We know you're inside. Come to the door with your hands visible. Nothing. Thompson tried again. This is your final warning. We're coming in. Still nothing. We breached the back door. It opened easily. Whoever was inside hadn't bothered to relock it. The house was dark, quiet, but that smell hit us immediately. Not decay, not death, but something sour and stale, like someone had been living there without proper ventilation or hygiene. Police! Show yourself! We began clearing the house room by room. Kitchen was a mess. Not ransacked, but lived in. Dirty dishes in the sink, empty food containers on the counter, crumbs on the floor. Someone had definitely been eating here. The living room showed more signs of occupation. Blankets on the couch, more food wrappers, and here's what made my skin crawl. A notebook on the coffee table, filled with handwritten notes. I flipped it open while Rodriguez covered the stairs. The writing was cramped, obsessive. Tuesday, 7:23 p.m., Robert exits house, checks mailbox. Tuesday, 7:31 p.m., Robert returns inside, living room, light, on Tuesday, 8:15 p.m. Robert in kitchen, visible through window. Tuesday, 8:43 p.m., Robert watching TV, blue glow from front window. Page after page of observations about Robert Miller's daily routine. Times he left the house, when lights went on and off. What rooms he occupied. Dozens of entries going back weeks. Thompson, Rodriguez, you need to see this. They came down from the 2nd floor. Upstairs is clear, but there's more stuff up there. Looks like someone's been living in the master bedroom. I showed them the notebook. Rodriguez whistled low. Someone's been watching the watcher. Gets worse, Thompson said. There's photography equipment upstairs. Telephoto lens, tripod set up by the window, direct line of sight to Miller's house. Walsh was checking the basement. Her voice came up the stairs. Officers, we've got a problem down here. The basement had been converted into some kind of surveillance center. Multiple notebooks filled with observations, not just about Miller but about other neighbors too. Patricia and Robert Henderson's vacation schedule was documented in detail. Work schedules for families throughout the neighborhood. Children's school pickup times. Everything you'd need to know to monitor an entire community. But the worst part was the photographs. Hundreds of them, taken with that telephoto lens. Miller in his kitchen making breakfast. Other neighbors getting mail. Walking dogs, children playing in yards. All taken from inside the Henderson house while the family was away. "We need to get Miller out of his house," I said. "Whoever this is, they're obsessed with him specifically." Walsh radioed for additional units and a supervisor. This was escalating beyond a simple B&E. We had stalking, possibly planning for something worse. As we waited for backup, Rodriguez found something else. A detailed floor plan of Miller's house, hand-drawn but accurate. Entry points marked, room layouts, even the location of his bedroom window. "How would they get this information?" Rodriguez asked. Thompson was studying the photographs. "Some of these are taken from inside Miller's house. Look at this one. It's his kitchen, but the angle is from inside, looking toward the window where he'd be visible from here." The implication hit us all at the same time. Whoever had been living in the Henderson house hadn't just been watching Miller from a distance. They'd been inside his house too. My radio crackled. 2 to 3, this is 2. Adam 7, I'm your supervisor responding. ETA 3 minutes. Copy, Sarge. Be advised we've got a stalking situation, possibly more serious. Recommend we evacuate the target residence immediately. Copy that. Don't approach the subject residence until I arrive. Sergeant Patricia Williams arrived with 2 additional units. Williams had been my supervisor for 6 years. Tough cop, good instincts. I briefed her on what we'd found. "Jesus Christ," she said, flipping through the notebook. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the entries, at least 6 weeks, maybe longer. And Miller has no idea?" "He's been reporting the suspicious activity to us. He knew someone was in the Henderson house, but not that he was the target." Williams made the call. "We evacuate Miller now, search his house for signs of entry, then we sit and wait. Whoever this is will probably come back." Getting Miller out of his house proved more difficult than expected. When we approached his door, he was excited to hear about our findings, but reluctant to leave. "You found someone in the Henderson place? I knew it. I've been tracking their movements for days. Let me show you my log." That's when we realized the horrible truth. Miller pulled out his own notebook, filled with detailed observations about the activity in the Henderson house. Times when lights went on and off, movements in windows, patterns of behavior. While Miller had been watching the Henderson house, someone in the Henderson house had been watching him. They were both surveillance logs, both detailed, both obsessive. But Miller's was part of his neighborhood watch duties. The other was something much darker. "Mr. Miller," Williams said carefully, "we need you to come with us right now. Don't pack anything. Don't make any phone calls. We believe you may be in immediate danger." "Danger? What kind of danger?" I showed him the photographs. Pictures of him taken from inside his own house. His face went pale. "Someone's been inside my home?" "We believe so. We need to search your house and we need you somewhere safe while we do it." We relocated Miller to the precinct while crime scene units processed both houses. What they found in Miller's house was even more disturbing than what we'd discovered across the street. Signs of repeated entry going back months. Tiny holes drilled in walls, probably for micro cameras. Food missing from the refrigerator in small amounts, not enough to be noticed by someone living alone. Personal items moved slightly, repositioned. Someone had been living in Miller's house part-time, learning his routines, studying his habits. But here's what really chilled me. They found evidence that whoever had been doing this had been inside Miller's house the same nights Miller had been across the street, doing his neighborhood watch duties. While Miller was watching the Henderson house, the intruder was inside Miller's house, watching Miller's empty rooms, going through his belongings, sleeping in his bed. The crime scene team found DNA evidence, hair follicles, saliva on drinking glasses, fingerprints on surfaces that had been wiped clean but missed spots. We ran everything through the system. The prints came back to someone named William Patterson, 43 years old, previous arrests for stalking and breaking and entering. Last known address in Queens, but that had been over 2 years ago. No employment records, no credit history, basically off the grid since 2017. What we learned about Patterson's background made the situation even more frightening. He had a pattern of targeting people involved in community safety. Neighborhood watch coordinators, block captains, anyone who positioned themselves as watching over others. He would study them for months, learn their routines, then move into their spaces while maintaining surveillance. He's not just a stalker, Williams said, reviewing Patterson's file. He's someone who stalks the watchers, gets off on turning the surveillance around. We issued a BOLO alert and set up surveillance on both houses, waiting for Patterson to return. Miller was relocated to a hotel under police protection while we worked the case. The waiting period gave us time to dig deeper into Patterson's methods. Detective Michael Rodriguez from our precinct joined the investigation, bringing his experience with organized stalking cases. "This isn't random," Rodriguez said, studying the evidence. "Patterson has a system. Look at how he selected Miller. Active neighborhood watch coordinator, lives alone. Predictable routine, house with multiple entry points." "You think there are other victims?" "I'd bet on it. Someone this organized, this methodical, doesn't stop with one target." Rodriguez contacted other precincts, asking about similar cases. Within 24 hours, we had reports of 3 possible related incidents from the past 2 years, all involving community safety volunteers who had reported signs of surveillance or intrusion, but never enough evidence to pursue charges. "Patterns consistent," Rodriguez explained. Patterson identifies community watch leaders, studies them extensively, then gradually infiltrates their private spaces while documenting their surveillance activities. But why? What's the end game? Power, control, proving a point. He sees neighborhood watch coordinators as amateur surveillance operators. His game is proving he's better at watching than they are. While we waited for Patterson to surface, we learned more about his background from federal databases. Military service in the 1990s, military police training, some kind of psychological discharge that the records didn't detail. After service, he'd worked as a private investigator until his license was revoked following stalking complaints. "Guy's got professional surveillance training," Rodriguez noted. "That explains the sophistication of his methods." The breakthrough came on our 3rd night of surveillance. I was positioned in an unmarked unit with a clear view of both houses when movement caught my eye around 11:30 p.m. A figure was approaching from the alley behind the Henderson house, moving carefully, staying in shadows, but definitely heading for the back door where we'd found evidence of forced entry. All units, suspect approaching target location from the rear, moving to intercept. We had 4 units positioned around the neighborhood. As the figure reached the back door of the Henderson house, we closed in from multiple angles with flashlights and weapons drawn. "Police! Stop right there, hands where we can see them." The man, tall, thin, wearing dark clothing, immediately bolted. He ran back toward the alley, but Thompson was already positioned there. They went down hard, the suspect fighting and screaming about his project and how we didn't understand what he was documenting. Patterson was exactly what I'd expected from his file photo. Mid-40s, average build, but his eyes had that intense focus you see in people who've spent too much time alone with their obsessions. At the station, Patterson's initial interview revealed someone who was completely convinced his actions were justified. "You don't understand," he told Detective Rodriguez. "These neighborhood watch people, they think they're protecting their communities, but they're just voyeurs. Busybodies with too much time on their hands." "So you decided to watch them back?" "I decided to show them what real surveillance looks like." Miller thought he was being observant, writing down license plate numbers, noting suspicious activity. But he never noticed that someone was inside his house, documenting his every move. "For how long, William?" Patterson smiled. 6 months. I've been inside his house, learning his routines, going through his belongings, sleeping in his bed. And he never had a clue." Patterson's interrogation revealed details that made our investigation much more complex. What we thought was the work of one disturbed individual was actually part of something larger and more organized. "I'm not the only one doing this," Patterson told Rodriguez during his second interview. "There are others. People who understand that these community watch programs are a joke." "What others? Give me names." "I don't know their real names. We communicate online, share techniques, compare notes on targets." Rodriguez leaned forward. "You're part of an online network?" "Forum dedicated to urban surveillance techniques. Counter-surveillance, really. Proving that civilian watchers aren't as observant as they think they are." This revelation changed everything. What we'd been treating as an isolated stalking case was potentially part of a coordinated effort targeting community safety programs. Rodriguez contacted Detective Sarah Collins from Manhattan South, who specialized in cybercrime and organized stalking. Collins had been tracking online networks involved in harassment campaigns against public figures. "This fits patterns we've been seeing," Collins told us when she arrived to consult on the case. "Online communities that recruit and train individuals to conduct systematic harassment of specific target groups. How organized are we talking?" "Depends on the network. Some are just informal discussion groups. Others have sophisticated recruitment, training, and coordination systems." Collins worked with Patterson to access the online forums he'd mentioned. What they found was more disturbing than we'd anticipated. The forums were sophisticated operations with multiple layers of security, encrypted messaging, anonymous file sharing, detailed training materials on surveillance techniques. Hundreds of active members discussing ongoing operations against neighborhood watch coordinators across multiple states. "This isn't just harassment," Collins explained. "It's a coordinated intelligence gathering operation, targeting community safety programs." "Intelligence for what purpose?" "That's what we need to find out." Patterson's cooperation gave us access to forum discussions revealing the scope of their activities. Members shared detailed surveillance reports on community leaders, photographics of target residences, information about security systems and daily routines. But the conversations also revealed something more sinister. Discussion of Phase 2 operations that went beyond surveillance and documentation. Phase 2 involves direct action, Patterson explained when pressed about these discussions. Confronting targets with evidence of how thoroughly they've been compromised. Proving to them that their community watch activities are useless. What kind of confrontation? Psychological operations. Letting them know how much we know about their personal lives, their families, their vulnerabilities. Most of them withdraw from community involvement after that. Rodriguez and I exchanged glances. This wasn't just stalking for personal gratification. It was organized intimidation, designed to shut down community safety programs. "William, how many people are involved in these operations?" "Active surveillance operators? Maybe 20 or 30 that I know of." but there are more in training, more being recruited. Collins worked with federal cybercrime specialists to trace the forum's infrastructure. What they discovered was a sophisticated recruitment and training network with connections to organized crime. Someone's funding this, Collins reported after 2 days of investigation. The server costs, equipment purchases, coordination expenses. This isn't being run by volunteers. How much funding? Conservative estimate? Several $100,000 annually. Someone with serious money is investing in this operation. The financial investigation led to a joint task force involving the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Unit. What had started as a simple breaking and entering call was now a federal case involving organized criminal activity. Special Agent Diana Foster from the Joint Terrorism Task Force took over coordination of the federal response. What you've uncovered fits patterns we've been tracking nationally, Foster told us during her first briefing. Organized efforts to disrupt community-based law enforcement cooperation. Meaning, what exactly? Community policing initiatives, neighborhood watch programs, civilian surveillance. These have made it much harder for criminal organizations to operate in residential areas. Someone's developed a systematic approach to neutralizing these programs. Foster explained how the surveillance networks operated. Online recruitment identified individuals with the psychological profile needed for long-term stalking operations. These recruits were then trained in advanced surveillance techniques and assigned to target specific community leaders. The goal isn't just to gather intelligence. It's to create enough fear and intimidation that community safety programs collapse from within. But the operation served another purpose. The detailed intelligence gathered on community leaders was being sold to other criminal organizations. Information about security systems, daily routines, family schedules, financial vulnerabilities. This data has significant commercial value for burglary rings, identity theft operations, even organized crime groups planning major operations. The federal investigation moved quickly. Patterson's cooperation provided access to the online networks, which led to identification of the operation's leadership structure. The network was led by Vincent Caruso, a career criminal with connections to organized crime families throughout the Northeast. Caruso had realized that traditional criminal territorial control was being undermined by community involvement in law enforcement. Instead of trying to corrupt or intimidate entire communities, Caruso developed this surveillance network to target the specific individuals who made community safety programs effective, Foster explained. Remove the leaders, and the programs collapse. Much more efficient than trying to control entire neighborhoods. The investigation into Vincent Caruso's organization revealed the full scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just stalking or harassment. It was a sophisticated criminal intelligence operation designed to undermine community safety programs throughout the Northeast. Agent Foster briefed us on Caruso's background during a joint task force meeting at Federal Plaza. Caruso had been involved in organized crime for over 20 years, specializing in operations that required detailed intelligence gathering and long-term planning. Caruso's organization had been losing territory for years, Foster explained. Every time they tried to establish operations in a new neighborhood, community groups would organize, contact police, pressure local politicians. Traditional intimidation wasn't working anymore, so he developed this surveillance network instead. Exactly. Instead of fighting whole communities, they decided to target the individuals who made community resistance possible. The financial investigation revealed the true scale of Caruso's operation. The surveillance network was generating significant revenue from multiple sources, selling intelligence to other criminal organizations, gathering information for burglary and identity theft operations, and conducting political intelligence for various clients. Conservative estimate, they were generating over $2 million annually from intelligence sales, Foster said. This had become a major profit center. But the operation's primary purpose remained neutralizing community safety programs. The psychological impact on targeted community leaders was devastating enough that most withdrew from civic involvement entirely. Detective Rodriguez had been working with Patterson to identify other victims. The list was extensive and disturbing. We've confirmed at least 37 community leaders who were subjected to surveillance over the past 3 years, Rodriguez reported. Neighborhood watch coordinators, community board members, block captains, anti-crime activists. How many knew they were being watched? Less than half. Most never realized they'd been infiltrated. Only the ones who noticed obvious signs or got careless operators like Patterson ever called police. The victims who had discovered the surveillance described similar experiences to Miller's case. Signs that someone had been inside their homes, personal items moved, food missing in small quantities. Most had assumed they were imagining things or blamed family members. The psychological impact was severe even when victims weren't certain what was happening, Rodriguez continued. Sense of violation, paranoia, withdrawal from community activities. Exactly what the operation was designed to achieve. Agent Foster shared intelligence from other federal investigations, revealing that similar networks were operating in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. This appears to be a coordinated national effort, Foster said. Multiple criminal organizations have developed comparable surveillance networks targeting community safety programs. Are they connected? We believe they share training materials, techniques, and possibly coordination through higher-level organized crime connections. Someone's been spreading this model deliberately. The federal task force began identifying Caruso's key personnel. Patterson had been just one of dozens of surveillance operators, recruited through online forums and trained in advanced stalking techniques. The recruiting coordinator was Anthony Messina, a former private investigator who had developed the online training programs. Messina had created sophisticated psychological assessment tools to identify individuals suitable for long-term surveillance operations. Messina's recruitment process was extremely sophisticated, Foster explained. He would identify people with specific psychological profiles, social isolation, obsessive tendencies, resentment toward authority figures, then gradually radicalize them against community safety programs. How would he find these people? Online forums dedicated to urban exploration, amateur surveillance, photography, even conspiracy theories. He'd identify promising candidates, then slowly introduce them to anti-community watch messaging. The training process was equally sophisticated. New recruits would spend months learning surveillance techniques, counter-surveillance methods, and psychological manipulation strategies before being assigned to actual targets. By the time they were conducting operations, they genuinely believed they were exposing the ineffectiveness of neighborhood watch programs, Foster continued. Most had no idea they were working for organized crime. Patterson's case was typical. He'd been recruited through urban exploration forums, slowly trained over several months, then assigned to target Miller, specifically because of Miller's effectiveness as a neighborhood watch coordinator. Miller had been instrumental in organizing community resistance to drug dealing in his neighborhood, Rodriguez explained. His surveillance efforts had led to several arrests, disrupted organized drug operations. He was exactly the kind of community leader Caruso wanted neutralized. The investigation also revealed how Caruso's network selected targets. They maintained detailed databases of community safety leaders throughout the region, tracking their effectiveness, influence, and potential vulnerabilities. They had files on hundreds of community leaders, Foster said. Detailed assessments of their impact on criminal operations, their personal security, their psychological profiles. It was like a targeting database for domestic terrorism. Some targets were selected for simple surveillance and intimidation. Others were chosen for more aggressive operations designed to destroy their credibility or force them to relocate. In extreme cases, they were gathering intelligence for physical attacks, Foster revealed. We found evidence of operational planning for at least 6 cases where they were considering escalating to violence. The scope of the intelligence gathering was staggering. Caruso's operatives had collected detailed information on targets' families, financial situations, personal relationships, medical conditions, and psychological vulnerabilities. They weren't just watching these people's community safety activities, Rodriguez said. They were conducting comprehensive intelligence operations designed to identify every possible pressure point. This information was then used for carefully orchestrated intimidation campaigns. Targets would receive anonymous messages demonstrating detailed knowledge of their personal lives, or they'd discover evidence that someone had been inside their homes. The goal was always to make them feel completely vulnerable, Foster explained. Once they realized how thoroughly they'd been compromised, most people withdrew from community involvement rather than risk escalation. But some targets couldn't be intimidated. For these individuals, Caruso's organization had developed more extreme measures. Agent Foster's next revelation sent shockwaves through our task force. While reviewing files seized from Caruso's operation, federal investigators had discovered detailed assassination plans for community leaders who couldn't be intimidated or driven away from their civic activities. We found operational blueprints for eliminating 6 high-priority targets, Foster told us during our briefing at Federal Plaza, complete with surveillance intelligence, timing plans, and methods designed to make the deaths appear accidental. The targets were community safety leaders who had been particularly effective at organizing law enforcement cooperation in their neighborhoods. All had been subjected to months of surveillance, psychological pressure, and intimidation. When these methods failed to neutralize them, Caruso's organization began planning more permanent solutions. The level of detail was professional grade, Foster continued. Daily routine analysis, security vulnerability assessments, optimal timing for undetected approach. These weren't impulse plans. They were carefully developed operational strategies. One of the targets was Margaret Chen, a community board member in Chinatown who had been instrumental in getting surveillance cameras installed and organizing regular police patrols. Despite months of psychological pressure, she had refused to back down from her community safety advocacy. Chen's file contained detailed plans for staging a robbery homicide, Foster explained. They'd studied her routines, identified the optimal location for an ambush, even planned the crime scene staging to make it appear random. Another target was David Williams, a neighborhood watch coordinator in Brooklyn who had been working with police to shut down illegal gambling operations. Williams had noticed signs of surveillance and increased his personal security, but continued his community safety work. Williams's assassination plan involved a staged car accident, Foster said. They'd documented his daily commute, identified a location where they could force his vehicle off the road, make it appear like a single-car crash. The most disturbing case involved Patricia Ross, a community activist in Queens who had been organizing resident cooperation with gang task force operations. Ross had been subjected to extensive psychological pressure, including break-ins at her home and anonymous threats. When intimidation failed to stop Ross, they began planning what they called a home invasion gone wrong, Foster revealed. Complete invasion scenario designed to eliminate her while making it appear like a burglary escalated to violence. The assassination plans revealed the true nature of Caruso's organization. This wasn't just organized stalking or intelligence gathering. It was domestic terrorism designed to eliminate effective community safety leadership. These people weren't planning to harm random civilians, Foster emphasized. They were specifically targeting individuals whose community safety work threatened organized criminal operations. Detective Rodriguez had been reviewing the target selection criteria used by Caruso's network. The patterns were chilling in their systematic approach. They ranked community leaders based on their effectiveness at organizing police cooperation, Rodriguez explained. High-impact organizers who couldn't be intimidated were marked for elimination. How many were marked? 6 had active assassination plans, but their database contained escalation assessments for over 40 community leaders throughout the region. The escalation assessments were detailed psychological profiles designed to predict which targets could be intimidated and which would require more aggressive measures. They were literally maintaining kill lists, Rodriguez continued. Community volunteers who thought they were just organizing neighborhood watch programs had no idea they were being evaluated for potential assassination. Agent Foster explained how federal authorities had discovered these plans. Patterson's cooperation had provided access to the organization's internal communications, revealing discussions about permanent solutions for high-priority targets. The communications were coded, but the meaning was clear, Foster said. They were discussing murder as a business decision, cost-benefit analysis of assassination versus continued surveillance and intimidation. The federal investigation revealed that Caruso's organization had been escalating their operations gradually. What started as simple surveillance had evolved into psychological warfare, then planned violence. The pattern suggests they were testing methods, refining techniques, building toward a coordinated campaign of assassinations, Foster explained. If we hadn't discovered them when we did, they probably would have begun killing community leaders within months. The evidence also revealed connections to other criminal organizations. Caruso's intelligence network was sharing information with drug trafficking operations, illegal gambling rings, and protection racket schemes throughout the Northeast. Community safety programs had been disrupting multiple types of criminal activity, Foster said. Caruso's network was providing a service to the broader, organized crime community. This explained the sophisticated funding and coordination of the surveillance operation. Multiple criminal organizations were contributing resources because they all benefited from neutralizing community safety leadership. It was like a criminal conspiracy specifically designed to destroy community policing initiatives, Rodriguez observed. They'd identified community involvement as the primary threat to their operations. The assassination plans also revealed the organization's long-term strategy. They weren't planning random violence. They were developing a systematic campaign to eliminate the most effective community safety leaders throughout the region. Once they'd eliminated the top organizers, community safety programs would collapse from fear and lack of leadership, Foster explained. Neighborhoods would withdraw from cooperation with law enforcement, creating opportunities for criminal organizations to reestablish territorial control. But the assassination plans contained another disturbing element. They included provisions for recruiting new surveillance operators from the communities where assassinations occurred. They planned to use the fear generated by murders to recruit new followers, Foster revealed. Community members traumatized by violence against their leaders would be approached with propaganda about the futility of community safety efforts. This recruitment strategy would have created a self-perpetuating cycle. Assassinations would destroy community safety leadership while simultaneously generating new recruits for future surveillance operations. It was designed to spread like a virus, Rodriguez said. Each successful assassination would weaken community safety programs while strengthening their surveillance network. The federal task force realized they were dealing with something unprecedented: organized crime specifically adapted to neutralize modern community policing methods. Traditional organized crime relied on corruption and territorial intimidation, Foster explained. This network represented evolution toward targeted elimination of community safety infrastructure. The implications were staggering. If successful, Caruso's model could have been replicated in cities throughout the country, systematically destroying community involvement in law enforcement cooperation. The federal task force moved quickly once they understood the scope of Caruso's operation. Plans were developed for coordinated arrests across multiple states, targeting not just the leadership, but the entire surveillance network that had been systematically stalking community safety leaders. Agent Foster coordinated the operation from Federal Plaza, working with local law enforcement agencies throughout the Northeast. The complexity of the network required simultaneous raids to prevent evidence destruction and flight by key personnel. We identified 47 individuals directly involved in surveillance operations, Foster briefed us during the final planning session. Plus 14 in leadership and coordination roles. This has to be executed simultaneously or we'll lose half of them. The arrests were scheduled for a Tuesday morning in November 2021. I was assigned to the team arresting Anthony Messina, the recruitment coordinator who had operated under the screen name Silent Eye in the online forums where Patterson had been recruited. Messina lived in a converted warehouse space in Long Island City, Queens. The building had been converted to artist lofts, but Messina was using his unit as a sophisticated surveillance operations center. We breached his door at exactly 6 a.m., coordinated with raids happening simultaneously across 5 states. Messina was awake, apparently monitoring multiple computer screens when we entered. Anthony Messina, FBI, you're under arrest. Messina's apartment was a revelation. Multiple computer workstations, professional surveillance equipment, detailed files on hundreds of community leaders throughout the Northeast. The walls were covered with organizational charts, surveillance timelines, and photographs taken by his recruited operatives. You have no idea what you've disrupted, Messina told us during his arrest. There are community leaders all over this city who think they're safe because they've got neighborhood watch programs. They have no idea how vulnerable they really are. The equipment in Messina's apartment was sophisticated enough to rival professional private investigation firms. High-end cameras with telephoto lenses, electronic surveillance devices, computer systems for coordinating multiple ongoing operations. But the most disturbing discovery was his recruitment files. Detailed psychological profiles on hundreds of individuals who had been assessed as potential surveillance operatives. He wasn't just recruiting random people, Agent Foster explained as we processed the scene. He was conducting systematic psychological evaluations to identify individuals with the specific personality traits needed for long-term stalking operations. The recruitment files revealed Messina's methods. He would identify potential candidates through online forums, social media activity, and even job application databases. Then he'd conduct elaborate psychological assessments disguised as academic research or employment screening. The assessments were designed to identify social isolation, obsessive tendencies, resentment toward authority, and willingness to engage in surveillance activities, Foster continued. Only candidates who met specific psychological criteria were recruited for actual operations. Among Messina's files, we found detailed training materials that had been used to transform recruits into sophisticated surveillance operatives. The training process was gradual and methodical. designed to slowly radicalize participants while teaching them advanced stalking techniques. New recruits would spend months in online training programs, Foster explained as we reviewed the materials. They'd start with basic surveillance theory, gradually move to advanced techniques, then begin practicing on low-priority targets before being assigned to actual community leaders. The training materials were professionally developed, complete with instructional videos, practice exercises, and psychological conditioning techniques designed to overcome recruits' natural reluctance to invade others' privacy. Messina had developed an entire curriculum for training stalkers, Rodriguez observed. This wasn't amateur hour. It was systematic preparation for criminal activity. But perhaps the most chilling discovery in Messina's apartment was his target database. Detailed files on over 300 community safety leaders throughout the Northeast, complete with threat assessments, operational plans, and elimination criteria. He'd been systematically cataloging every effective community organizer in the region, Foster said, ranking them by their impact on criminal operations, their vulnerability to intimidation, their potential for elimination. The database revealed that Miller's case had been considered a training operation, a low-risk assignment designed to test Patterson's capabilities before moving him to higher priority targets. Miller was selected specifically because he was isolated, predictable, and operating in a low-crime area, Foster explained. They wanted to see how thoroughly Patterson could infiltrate a neighborhood watch coordinator's life without being detected. Meanwhile, across the city, other arrest teams were discovering similar operations centers. Vincent Caruso himself was arrested at his residence in Staten Island, where investigators found the central coordination facility for the entire surveillance network. Caruso's operation was even more sophisticated than Messina's recruitment center. Multiple secure communication systems, financial records showing payments to dozens of surveillance operatives, and detailed intelligence reports from operations throughout the region. Caruso's place looked like a corporate headquarters, reported Detective Lisa Wang from the team that arrested him. Professional office setup, administrative staff, even regular business meetings with department heads. The business records seized from Caruso's operation revealed the financial scope of their activities. Over $2 million in annual revenue from intelligence sales, with detailed accounting of payments to surveillance operatives, equipment purchases, and operational expenses. They were running this like a legitimate business, Wang continued. Formal organizational structure, performance reviews for operatives, even health insurance for full-time surveillance staff. But the most disturbing documents found at Caruso's facility were the escalation protocols, detailed procedures for transitioning from surveillance to intimidation to elimination, complete with decision trees for determining when assassination became necessary. They had bureaucratized murder, Foster observed grimly, systematic procedures for deciding which community leaders should be killed, when, and how. The arrest of the surveillance operatives revealed the true scope of the network. 47 individuals conducting active surveillance operations against community leaders throughout the Northeast. Most, like Patterson, had no idea they were working for organized crime. The majority of the operatives genuinely believed they were exposing the ineffectiveness of neighborhood watch programs, Foster explained during our post-arrest briefing. They'd been gradually radicalized to view community safety advocates as hypocrites and voyeurs. Many of the arrested operatives expressed shock when they learned about the organization's criminal connections and assassination plans. They'd been carefully compartmentalized, knowing only their specific assignments and believing they were part of an informal activist movement. It's a classic recruitment technique for extremist organizations, Foster said. Gradually indoctrinate people while keeping them isolated from the broader criminal agenda. But some operatives had been aware of the organization's true nature. These individuals, typically the more experienced surveillance specialists, had been directly involved in intelligence gathering for burglary operations and intimidation campaigns. About 15 of the arrestees were fully aware they were supporting organized crime, Foster reported. These were the senior operatives who'd been involved in multiple operations and received significant financial compensation. The arrests disrupted dozens of ongoing surveillance operations throughout the region. Community leaders who had been living under constant observation suddenly found themselves free from the psychological pressure they'd been experiencing for months. The immediate impact was significant, Rodriguez noted. We started getting calls from community safety volunteers who said they suddenly felt like they could breathe again. But the arrests also revealed how extensively community safety programs had been infiltrated. Evidence seized during the raids showed that surveillance operatives had penetrated neighborhood watch programs, community board meetings, and even police community liaison programs. They'd been gathering intelligence from inside the very organizations they were targeting, Foster explained. Some operatives had actually joined neighborhood watch programs to gather information on coordinators and other participants. This internal infiltration had provided Caruso's organization with detailed intelligence on community safety program operations, enabling them to predict and counter law enforcement community policing initiatives. They knew about police community meetings before they happened, had advance warning of neighborhood watch patrol schedules, even had inside information on crime prevention programs, Rodriguez said. It was systematic penetration of community law enforcement cooperation. The evidence also revealed that some community safety programs had been entirely compromised. In several neighborhoods, multiple surveillance operatives had joined watch programs, effectively turning them into intelligence-gathering operations for organized crime. Some neighborhood watch programs had more criminals than legitimate volunteers, Foster observed. Community members thought they were organizing to fight crime, but they were actually providing intelligence to criminal organizations. The interrogation phase of the investigation revealed the psychological complexity of Caruso's recruitment and training methods. Most of the arrested surveillance operatives had been systematically conditioned to view their activities as legitimate activism rather than criminal stalking. I participated in several interviews with operatives who had been working in our precinct's jurisdiction. Their stories revealed sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that had gradually transformed ordinary citizens into dedicated stalkers. Jennifer Walsh, one of Patterson's fellow operatives, had been recruited through online photography forums. A divorced accountant in her early 50s, Walsh had initially joined surveillance operations believing she was documenting the ineffectiveness of community safety programs. I thought I was exposing hypocrites, Walsh explained during her interview. These neighborhood watch people, they acted like they were protecting everyone, but they were just busybodies looking through their neighbors' windows. Walsh described how her recruitment had progressed over 18 months. Initial contact through photography forums led to private messages about documentary projects exposing community surveillance programs. Gradually, she was introduced to more explicit anti-neighborhood watch messaging. They convinced me that community watch coordinators were the real voyeurs, Walsh continued. That they were violating people's privacy under the guise of community safety. I thought I was turning the tables, showing them what it felt like to be watched. The psychological conditioning was sophisticated enough that Walsh genuinely believed she was conducting legitimate activism even while breaking into people's homes and documenting their most private moments. I never thought of it as stalking, she said. They taught us that we were researchers, documentarians, exposing the truth about community surveillance programs. Walsh had been assigned to target Susan Martinez, a community board member who had been organizing resident cooperation with police gang task force operations. For 8 months, Walsh had been systematically infiltrating Martinez's life. I documented everything, Walsh explained. Her daily routines, family relationships, work schedule, financial situation. I thought I was gathering evidence of how neighborhood watch people were just ordinary citizens with ordinary vulnerabilities. What was the plan for this information? Eventually, we were supposed to confront her with it. Show her how thoroughly we documented her life while she thought she was the one doing the watching. Prove that her community safety work was meaningless. But Walsh's surveillance had gone far beyond simple documentation. She'd been inside Martinez's home dozens of times, photographed personal documents, even recorded private conversations with hidden microphones. I told myself it was necessary for the project, Walsh said, that we needed comprehensive documentation to make our point effectively. The interview revealed how Caruso's organization had exploited Walsh's personal vulnerabilities. Her divorce had left her socially isolated and resentful toward authority figures. The surveillance activities provided both social connection and a sense of power. For the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something important, Walsh admitted. The other operatives became like family. We were working together on something that felt meaningful. This sense of community among the surveillance operatives had been carefully cultivated by Messina's recruitment program. Regular online meetings, shared operational experiences, and group activities designed to strengthen emotional bonds between operatives. They created a support network for people conducting criminal activities, Agent Foster observed. Made stalking feel like community service. Other interviews revealed similar patterns. Mark Thompson, a retired electrician who had been surveilling neighborhood watch coordinators in Queens, described how his recruitment had begun with discussions about government overreach and civilian surveillance. They started talking about how neighborhood watch programs were just extensions of police surveillance, Thompson explained. How ordinary citizens were being turned into informants and voyeurs by law enforcement. Thompson's anti-government sentiments had been gradually directed toward community safety volunteers, who were portrayed as willing participants in police surveillance programs. I came to believe that neighborhood watch coordinators were betraying their communities, Thompson continued. That they were helping police spy on their neighbors under the guise of safety. This ideological framework had enabled Thompson to justify extensive surveillance activities against David Chen, a community organizer who had been working to improve police-community relations in his neighborhood. I thought I was protecting the community from police surveillance, Thompson said, showing them that their trusted neighborhood watch coordinator was actually gathering intelligence for law enforcement. Thompson had spent 6 months infiltrating Chen's personal life, documenting his family relationships, work activities, and community involvement. The intelligence had been passed to Caruso's organization for analysis and operational planning. What kind of operational planning? I didn't know at the time. I thought it was just for documentation purposes, proving our point about civilian surveillance programs. But Thompson's surveillance reports had actually been used to develop intimidation strategies against Chen. Anonymous messages containing personal information, evidence of home intrusions, and subtle threats designed to pressure Chen into withdrawing from community organizing. When I learned about the intimidation campaigns, I was shocked, Thompson admitted. I thought we were just documenting and exposing. I never intended to help with harassment. The interviews revealed that most operatives had been carefully shielded from the organization's criminal activities. They received specific assignments and training, but were not informed about the broader network or its connections to organized crime. Compartmentalization was key to their recruitment strategy, Foster explained. Most operatives knew only their specific targets and believed they were part of a grassroots activist movement. But some operatives had been aware of the criminal connections. These individuals, typically recruited through different channels, had been directly involved in intelligence, gathering for burglary operations and protection rackets. David Rodriguez, not related to our Detective Rodriguez, had been recruited through connections to illegal gambling operations. Unlike the ideologically motivated operatives, Rodriguez understood he was working for organized crime from the beginning. "I knew this was about business, not activism," Rodriguez told us during his interview. Community safety programs were hurting gambling operations, drug dealing, protection rackets. We were gathering intelligence to shut them down. Rodriguez had been involved in some of the most aggressive surveillance operations, including intelligence gathering for the planned assassinations of high-priority community leaders. Some targets couldn't be intimidated or bought off, Rodriguez explained. For those people, elimination was considered a business necessity. Were you prepared to participate in murders? If that's what the job required. These people were costing the organization significant money. Their community safety work was disrupting profitable operations. Rodriguez's matter-of-fact attitude toward assassination revealed the cold business logic behind Caruso's network. Community leaders weren't seen as people with families and lives. They were obstacles to criminal operations that needed to be removed. It wasn't personal, Rodriguez continued. It was just problem-solving. Find the most efficient way to neutralize threats to business operations. The interviews also revealed the extent of intelligence sharing between Caruso's network and other criminal organizations. Surveillance reports were being sold to burglary rings, identity theft operations, and even human trafficking networks. The information was incredibly valuable, Foster explained. Detailed intelligence on community leaders' personal lives, security vulnerabilities, family relationships. Multiple criminal organizations were buying this intelligence for different purposes. Some surveillance reports had been used to plan targeted home invasions. Others provided information for identity theft and financial fraud schemes. The most disturbing cases involved intelligence gathering on families with teenage children. We found evidence that surveillance intelligence was being sold to human trafficking operations, Foster revealed grimly. Information about family structures, children's schedules, security vulnerabilities. It was being used to identify potential trafficking victims. This revelation added another dimension to the federal charges against Caruso's organization. Beyond stalking and conspiracy, they were now facing charges related to human trafficking support operations. The complexity of the Caruso organization's criminal network required extensive preparation for what would become one of the largest domestic terrorism trials in New York history. The evidence collected during the investigation filled dozens of filing cabinets and required coordination between multiple federal agencies. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen was assigned to prosecute the case. Chen had 15 years of experience with organized crime prosecutions and had handled several high-profile domestic terrorism cases. "This is unlike anything we've prosecuted before," Chen told our task force during trial preparation. "We're dealing with a criminal organization that specifically targeted the infrastructure of community safety programs. It's domestic terrorism designed to undermine law enforcement cooperation." The prosecution strategy focused on demonstrating the systematic nature of the surveillance network and its connections to broader organized crime activities. Chen planned to show how individual stalking cases like Patterson's were part of a coordinated campaign against community safety leadership. Each surveillance operation was a component of a larger conspiracy to disrupt community policing initiatives, Chen explained. We need to help the jury understand that these weren't isolated incidents, but coordinated attacks on community safety infrastructure. The evidence included thousands of hours of surveillance footage, detailed intelligence reports on community leaders, financial records showing payments to surveillance operatives, and communications between network coordinators. But perhaps the most powerful evidence was the testimony of victims like Robert Miller, who could describe the psychological impact of learning they'd been systematically infiltrated and observed. Miller had initially been reluctant to testify. The trauma of discovering that someone had been living in his house, documenting his private activities, and planning potential escalation had left him deeply shaken. "I don't want to relive it," Miller told Chen during preparation sessions. "I just want to forget the whole thing and move on with my life." But Chen convinced Miller that his testimony was crucial for demonstrating the real-world impact of the surveillance network. "Your experience shows the jury what this conspiracy actually accomplished," Chen explained, "how it destroyed people's sense of security and undermined their willingness to participate in community safety programs." Miller's testimony would be supported by evidence from Patterson's surveillance operation. The photographs, detailed observation logs, and documentation of home intrusions provided concrete evidence of how thoroughly victims had been compromised. Other victims were also reluctant to testify. Susan Martinez, the community board member who had been targeted by Jennifer Walsh, had stopped all community involvement after learning about the surveillance. "I can't trust anyone anymore," Martinez told us during victim interviews. "How do I know who's legitimate and who's gathering intelligence for criminal organizations? I just keep to myself now." Martinez's withdrawal from community organizing was exactly what Caruso's network had intended to achieve. Even without direct intimidation or violence, the psychological impact of the surveillance had effectively neutralized her community safety work. The victim's testimony will show the jury how the conspiracy succeeded in its goals, Chen explained. Even when targets weren't physically harmed, the surveillance operations achieved their purpose of disrupting community safety programs. The prosecution also planned to present evidence of the network's connections to other criminal activities. Financial records showed that surveillance intelligence had been sold to multiple criminal organizations throughout the Northeast. "We can demonstrate that this wasn't just stalking for personal gratification," Chen said. "This was a criminal enterprise generating significant revenue by undermining community safety initiatives and selling intelligence to other criminal organizations." The evidence of planned assassinations would be crucial for demonstrating the ultimate goals of the network. Chen planned to show how surveillance operations were designed to escalate to violence when intimidation failed. "The assassination plans show the conspiracy's true nature," Chen explained. "This was organized terrorism against community leaders, designed to eliminate effective opposition to criminal operations." But the defense attorneys were preparing their own strategy. Many of the surveillance operatives had been recruited through ideological manipulation rather than direct criminal intent. Patterson's attorney, Maria Santos, planned to argue that her client had been victimized by sophisticated psychological manipulation. William Patterson genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate activism, Santos explained during pretrial hearings. He was systematically deceived and manipulated by a criminal organization that exploited his personal vulnerabilities. Santos planned to present expert testimony about recruitment and indoctrination techniques used by extremist organizations. "My client was essentially brainwashed," Santos argued. "He was isolated, vulnerable, and systematically conditioned to view stalking activities as community service." Similar defense strategies were being prepared for other operatives who had been recruited through ideological manipulation. Their attorneys argued that sophisticated psychological conditioning had made them unwitting participants in criminal activities. But the defense strategy was more challenging for operatives like David Rodriguez, who had understood the criminal nature of their activities from the beginning. Rodriguez's attorney, Frank Torino, planned to argue for reduced sentences based on cooperation with federal investigators. "My client provided substantial assistance to law enforcement," Torino argued. His cooperation was crucial for understanding the full scope of the criminal network. The prosecution was willing to consider reduced sentences for operatives who had provided significant cooperation, but Chen insisted that all participants needed to face serious consequences. Even the operatives who were manipulated still committed serious crimes, Chen explained. They invaded people's homes, stalked community leaders, participated in psychological terrorism. Good intentions or manipulation don't excuse criminal behavior. The trial preparation also revealed the challenge of protecting community leaders who had been targeted by the network. Even with the organization dismantled, many victims remained fearful that other criminal groups might target them. The psychological impact extends far beyond the individual victims, Agent Foster observed. Community leaders throughout the region are now aware that their safety work makes them potential targets for criminal surveillance. Some community safety programs had disbanded entirely after learning about the surveillance network. Others had implemented security measures that made it difficult to maintain the open, accessible approach that made neighborhood watch programs effective. "It's exactly what the conspiracy was designed to achieve," Chen noted. "Even after we've arrested the perpetrators, they've succeeded in disrupting community safety programs through fear and paranoia." The broader implications of the case were also being considered by federal policymakers. The Department of Justice was developing new guidelines for investigating and prosecuting organized surveillance networks targeting community safety programs. "This case has revealed a new type of domestic terrorism," Foster explained. "Criminal organizations adapting their methods to specifically target community law enforcement cooperation. We need new legal frameworks and investigative techniques to address this threat." The trial was scheduled to begin in March 2022, with proceedings expected to last several months given the complexity of the evidence and the number of defendants. The trial of the Caruso surveillance network began on March 15, 2022, in a federal court in Manhattan. Judge Patricia Morrison, who had extensive experience with organized crime cases, presided over proceedings that would last 4 months and involved testimony from over 100 witnesses. The prosecution's opening argument, delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, laid out the systematic nature of the conspiracy against community safety programs. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a criminal organization that declared war on community safety," Chen began. Not content to simply commit crimes, they developed a sophisticated network to identify, infiltrate, and eliminate the very people who were trying to protect their neighbors. Chen outlined how the network had evolved from simple surveillance to planned assassinations, showing how each component of the operation contributed to the broader goal of dismantling community law enforcement cooperation. "The defendants didn't just stalk individual victims," Chen continued. "They systematically attacked the infrastructure that makes community safety possible. They turned the tools of protection into weapons of intimidation." The prosecution's case was built around 3 main components: demonstrating the organized nature of the surveillance network, showing connections to broader criminal activities, and revealing the ultimate goal of eliminating community safety leadership. Robert Miller was among the first witnesses to testify. His account of discovering that Patterson had been living in his house while he conducted neighborhood watch activities provided a concrete example of how the surveillance network operated. "I thought I was protecting my community," Miller testified. "I had no idea that while I was watching for suspicious activity, someone was inside my home, going through my belongings, sleeping in my bed." Miller's testimony was accompanied by evidence from Patterson's surveillance operation, photographs taken inside Miller's house, detailed logs of his daily activities, and documentation of the intrusion methods used to gain access. The defendant had been inside Mr. Miller's residence dozens of times over 6 months, Chen explained to the jury. He knew Mr. Miller's routines better than Mr. Miller knew them himself. Cross-examination by Patterson's defense attorney focused on the psychological manipulation that had led to his participation in the surveillance network. "Isn't it true that Mr. Patterson genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate research?" asked Maria Santos. "I don't know what he believed," Miller replied. "I only know that he violated my home, my privacy, my sense of security. The impact on my life has been devastating, regardless of his motivations." Susan Martinez provided similarly powerful testimony about the psychological impact of learning she had been systematically surveilled by Jennifer Walsh. "I stopped going to community board meetings," Martinez testified. "I stopped organizing neighborhood watch activities. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. How do you know who's legitimate and who's gathering intelligence for criminals?" Martinez's withdrawal from community organizing demonstrated the effectiveness of the surveillance network's intimidation tactics. Even without direct threats or violence, the psychological impact had achieved the goal of neutralizing community safety leadership. The prosecution also presented evidence of the network's recruitment and training methods. Anthony Messina's detailed training materials showed how recruits were gradually conditioned to view stalking activities as legitimate activism. "These weren't random crimes," Chen explained. "This was systematic preparation of individuals to conduct sophisticated surveillance operations against community leaders." Expert witnesses testified about the psychological techniques used to recruit and indoctrinate surveillance operatives. Dr. Sarah Williams, a forensic psychologist with expertise in extremist recruitment, explained how vulnerable individuals were identified and gradually radicalized. The recruitment process exploited specific psychological vulnerabilities, Dr. Williams testified: social isolation, economic frustration, resentment toward authority figures. The defendants used sophisticated manipulation techniques to transform these vulnerabilities into criminal behavior. The prosecution's evidence of planned assassinations provided the most dramatic moments of the trial. Detailed operational plans for eliminating community leaders who couldn't be intimidated were presented to show the ultimate goals of the conspiracy. "These weren't vague threats," Chen emphasized. "These were detailed blueprints for murder, surveillance intelligence, timing plans, methods designed to make deaths appear accidental. The defendants were prepared to kill community volunteers to protect their criminal operations." The financial evidence demonstrated the commercial nature of the surveillance network. Records showing payments to operatives, equipment purchases, and intelligence sales to other criminal organizations revealed the systematic funding of the conspiracy. "This wasn't ideology or activism," Chen argued. "This was a business. The defendants were generating millions of dollars by attacking community safety programs and selling intelligence to other criminal organizations." The defense strategy varied significantly among the different defendants. Caruso's attorney argued that the prosecution had failed to prove his client's direct involvement in specific surveillance operations. "Vincent Caruso is a businessman," argued defense attorney Robert Patterson. "The prosecution wants you to believe he was the mastermind of this alleged conspiracy, but they haven't provided evidence of his direct participation in any surveillance activities. but the financial records and communications evidence clearly established Caruso's leadership role in coordinating and funding the surveillance network. Messina's defense focused on his role as a trainer rather than an operational leader. His attorney argued that recruiting and training activities didn't constitute direct participation in stalking crimes. Anthony Messina provided educational services, argued defense attorney Linda Chen. Teaching surveillance techniques isn't illegal. The prosecution is trying to criminalize knowledge rather than actions. However, the prosecution demonstrated that Messina's training programs were specifically designed to prepare individuals for criminal stalking activities, making him a conspiracy participant rather than merely an educator. The defense strategy for the surveillance operatives focused heavily on the psychological manipulation they had experienced during recruitment and training. Patterson's attorney presented expert testimony about indoctrination techniques used by extremist organizations. William Patterson was systematically deceived and manipulated, argued Maria Santos. He was led to believe he was conducting legitimate activism rather than criminal stalking. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a clinical psychologist specializing in extremist psychology, testified about the sophisticated conditioning techniques used by the surveillance network. The defendants employed classic indoctrination methods, Dr. Rodriguez explained: gradual introduction of extremist ideology, social reinforcement for compliance, isolation from contrary viewpoints. These techniques can override normal moral constraints. But the prosecution countered with evidence of the operatives' sophisticated criminal activities. The detailed nature of their surveillance operations, the professional quality of their intelligence gathering, and their ability to avoid detection for months suggested conscious criminal intent rather than naive manipulation. These defendants weren't confused activists, Chen argued during closing arguments. They were skilled criminals who conducted sophisticated surveillance operations against community leaders. The evidence shows deliberate criminal behavior, not innocent manipulation. The jury deliberated for 6 days before returning verdicts on all defendants. The complexity of the case and the number of different charges required careful consideration of each defendant's role in the conspiracy. Vincent Caruso was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit stalking, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, and operating a criminal enterprise. The jury found that he had been the principal organizer and financier of the surveillance network. Anthony Messina was convicted of conspiracy to commit stalking, racketeering, and training individuals for criminal activities. The jury determined that his recruitment and training programs were integral components of the criminal conspiracy. Most of the surveillance operatives were convicted of stalking-related charges, but sentences varied based on their level of awareness and cooperation with authorities. Patterson received 8 years in federal prison after being convicted of stalking, breaking and entering, and conspiracy charges. His cooperation with the investigation resulted in a reduced sentence from the maximum 15 years he could have received. Jennifer Walsh received 6 years after demonstrating genuine remorse and providing extensive cooperation with federal investigators. David Rodriguez, who had been aware of the criminal nature of his activities, received 12 years for stalking, conspiracy, and providing support for planned violent crimes. The sentencing phase revealed the lasting impact of the surveillance network on its victims and the broader community safety programs throughout the region. The defendants' actions had consequences far beyond their immediate victims, Judge Morrison observed during sentencing. They undermined community trust, destroyed safety programs, and created fear that extends throughout the region. The conviction of the Caruso surveillance network marked the end of the largest domestic terrorism prosecution targeting community safety programs in U.S. history. But for those of us who had worked the case, and for the communities that had been targeted, the impact would continue for years. 3 years after the convictions, I still patrol the same neighborhoods I covered during the investigation. Maple Heights, where Robert Miller had been systematically surveilled while conducting his neighborhood watch duties, never recovered its sense of community security. Miller never returned to his house on Maple Heights Avenue. He sold it through a real estate agent while staying at his sister's place in New Jersey, unable to face the psychological trauma of living in a space that had been so thoroughly violated. "I can't walk into that house without imagining him there," Miller told me during our last conversation. "Sitting at my kitchen table, going through my mail, sleeping in my bed. The physical space will always be contaminated for me." Miller's story was unfortunately typical among the surveillance victims. Most never returned to their community safety roles, even after learning that their stalkers had been imprisoned. Susan Martinez, the community board member who had been targeted by Jennifer Walsh, relocated to a different state entirely. The trauma of learning that her private life had been systematically documented and analyzed had destroyed her sense of personal security. "How do you know you're safe?" Martinez asked me when I contacted her for a follow-up interview. "How do you know there aren't others out there, still watching, still gathering intelligence?" Her question reflected the broader psychological impact of the case on community safety volunteers throughout the region. Even though the surveillance network had been dismantled, the knowledge that such operations were possible created lasting paranoia. The Neighborhood Watch program in Maple Heights disbanded entirely within 6 months of the arrests. Other community safety programs throughout the Bronx saw dramatic reductions in volunteer participation as word spread about the systematic targeting of community leaders. "It achieved exactly what they wanted," Agent Foster observed during our final case review. "Even after we arrested them, they succeeded in disrupting community-based law enforcement cooperation." The broader implications of the case continued to unfold as federal investigators discovered similar networks in other cities. The model developed by Caruso's organization had been shared with criminal groups in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles. This represented a new evolution in organized crime, Foster explained. Instead of fighting entire communities, they learned to identify and neutralize the specific individuals who made community resistance possible. The federal response included new guidelines for investigating organized surveillance networks targeting community safety programs. The Department of Justice developed training materials for local law enforcement agencies to help them recognize signs of systematic targeting of community leaders. But the defensive measures proved challenging to implement. The very openness and accessibility that made community safety programs effective also made them vulnerable to infiltration and surveillance. "How do you protect community leaders without destroying the community-based nature of their work?" Foster asked during a conference on domestic terrorism prevention. "Secrecy and security measures undermine the transparency that makes Neighborhood Watch programs effective." Some communities attempted to address the problem by rotating leadership responsibilities, making it harder for surveillance networks to identify consistent targets. Others implemented background checks for community safety volunteers, but this created barriers to participation that reduced overall community involvement. The most lasting impact may have been the change in how community safety advocates thought about their personal security. Before the Caruso case, most Neighborhood Watch coordinators and community board members never considered that their civic involvement might make them targets for systematic surveillance. The psychological impact extends far beyond the specific victims, Dr. Sarah Williams observed during a follow-up study. Community leaders throughout the country now understand that their safety work carries personal risks they hadn't previously considered. This awareness created a chilling effect on community safety participation. Many potential volunteers decided that the personal risks outweighed their desire to help protect their neighborhoods. Detective Rodriguez, who had been instrumental in uncovering the scope of the surveillance network, transferred to a federal task force focused on investigating similar operations in other cities. This is the future of organized crime, Rodriguez told me before his transfer. They've learned that it's more efficient to neutralize community safety leadership than to fight entire communities. Rodriguez's new assignment involved tracking online recruitment networks similar to those used by Messina to identify and train surveillance operatives. The recruitment and training infrastructure is still active, Rodriguez explained. We shut down Caruso's network, but others have learned from their methods and developed more sophisticated approaches. Federal cybercrime specialists continued monitoring online forums where recruitment for surveillance operations was suspected to occur. But the networks had adapted, using more sophisticated encryption and security measures. They learned from Caruso's mistakes, Detective Wang from Cybercrimes explained. New networks are much harder to penetrate and investigate. The financial investigation revealed that Caruso's network had been part of a broader ecosystem of criminal intelligence gathering operations. The intelligence they gathered on community leaders was being shared with multiple criminal organizations throughout the Northeast. We disrupted one network, but the demand for this type of intelligence remains, Agent Foster noted. Other criminal organizations are likely developing their own surveillance capabilities. Some of the surveillance operatives, including Patterson, were released from prison after serving reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. But their reintegration into society proved challenging. Patterson, who served 4 years of his 8-year sentence, was relocated to a different state under supervised monitoring. But his experience in the surveillance network had left him psychologically damaged and unable to maintain normal relationships. He's essentially unemployable, his parole officer told me during a follow-up conversation. His skills are surveillance and stalking. There aren't many legitimate career paths for someone with that background. Jennifer Walsh, who had surveilled Susan Martinez, was released after serving 3 years of her 6-year sentence. She entered a rehabilitation program designed to help former extremists reintegrate into society. The psychological conditioning was so thorough that it took years of therapy to help her understand the criminal nature of her activities, explained Dr. Williams, who consulted on Walsh's rehabilitation. But some former operatives never fully recovered from their indoctrination. The systematic conditioning they had experienced during recruitment and training left lasting psychological damage that continued years after their release from prison. The broader question of how to protect community safety programs from systematic targeting remained unresolved. Federal agencies developed threat assessment protocols for community leaders, but implementation proved difficult given the volunteer nature of most safety programs. You can't provide federal protection for every neighborhood watch coordinator, Foster acknowledged. We need community-based solutions for a community-based problem. Some communities experimented with distributed leadership models, where safety coordination responsibilities were shared among multiple volunteers rather than concentrated in single individuals. This made it harder for surveillance networks to identify and target key organizers. Other communities implemented digital security training for safety volunteers, teaching them to recognize signs of surveillance and protect their personal information online. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the change in how law enforcement thought about community policing. The realization that community safety advocates could be systematically targeted by organized crime required new approaches to protecting civilian law enforcement cooperation. We had to acknowledge that encouraging community involvement in law enforcement carries real risks for volunteers, explained Captain Williams, who had been promoted to precinct commander. We have an obligation to protect the people who help us protect their communities. This led to new training programs for law enforcement officers on recognizing and investigating organized surveillance targeting community leaders. Officers learned to identify patterns of behavior that might indicate systematic stalking of safety volunteers. We realized we hadn't been taking these reports seriously enough, Williams continued. When community leaders reported signs of surveillance or intrusion, we often dismissed it as paranoia or coincidence. The case also changed how federal agencies tracked domestic terrorism threats. The targeting of community safety infrastructure was now recognized as a specific category of domestic terrorism, requiring specialized investigation techniques. Traditional domestic terrorism focused on government targets or symbolic attacks, Foster explained. This network showed us that terrorists can achieve their goals by systematically dismantling community safety infrastructure. 5 years after the arrests, I still think about the broader implications of the case when I respond to neighborhood watch reports. Every community safety volunteer I encounter knows they might be taking personal risks by organizing their neighbors to cooperate with law enforcement. The fear is still there, one neighborhood watch coordinator told me recently. Every time I organize a community meeting, I wonder who's taking notes for the wrong reasons. But despite the fear, many communities have maintained their safety programs. The alternative, abandoning community involvement in law enforcement, would hand criminal organizations exactly what they wanted. We can't let them win by being afraid to organize, another community leader explained. But we also can't pretend the risks don't exist. The balance between community engagement and personal security remains delicate. Communities throughout the region continue to struggle with maintaining effective safety programs while protecting the volunteers who make them possible. The question Robert Miller asked me during the early stages of the investigation continues to resonate. How can you protect your neighborhood when you can't even protect yourself? I still don't have a complete answer, but I know that the alternative, allowing fear to destroy community cooperation with law enforcement, would give criminal organizations exactly what they want. The Caruso case taught us that the very qualities that make community safety programs effective, openness, accessibility, volunteer leadership, also make them vulnerable to systematic targeting by sophisticated criminal networks. But it also showed us something else. That communities are resilient, that people will continue organizing to protect each other despite personal risks, and that law enforcement must adapt to protect those who help us protect others. The surveillance network was dismantled, the perpetrators were imprisoned, and the immediate threat was eliminated. But the knowledge that such operations are possible has permanently changed how we think about community safety work. Every neighborhood watch meeting, every community board session, every block party organized to build police-community relationships now carries the awareness that someone might be watching, documenting, planning. It's the new reality of community policing, Agent Foster observed during our final case review. Criminal organizations have learned to target the infrastructure that makes community safety possible. We have to learn to protect that infrastructure while maintaining its effectiveness. The case files remain in federal storage, evidence of what happened when criminal organizations declared war on community safety programs. But the real evidence is in the empty houses where families used to feel secure, the disbanded watch programs, the community leaders who chose silence over service. Sometimes the most effective terrorism isn't the kind that makes headlines. Sometimes it's the kind that quietly dismantles the bonds that hold communities together, one frightened volunteer at a time. The watchers were being watched, and in the end, many of them chose to look away rather than risk being seen. That may be the most lasting victory the surveillance network achieved. Not the intelligence they gathered or the operations they disrupted, but the fear they instilled in people who had dedicated themselves to protecting others. But not everyone looked away. Some community leaders, understanding the risks, chose to continue their safety work despite knowing they might be targets. Their courage, more than any law enforcement response, represents the real victory over the systematic intimidation campaign. They wanted us to be afraid, one neighborhood watch coordinator told me recently, and we are afraid. But we're more afraid of what happens to our community if we stop watching out for each other. The surveillance network taught criminal organizations that community safety programs could be disrupted through systematic targeting of leadership. But it also taught communities that their safety work carries real value, valuable enough that sophisticated criminal networks would invest millions of dollars trying to stop it. In the end, the question isn't whether community safety work is dangerous. The Caruso case proved that it is. The question is whether the danger is worth the result. For those who continue organizing their neighbors, coordinating with police, watching out for suspicious activity, the answer remains yes. They understand that the price of abandoning community safety might be higher than the risk of maintaining it. My name is Officer Michael Sullivan. I work patrol for the 109th Precinct in Northeast Queens, covering a mix of suburban neighborhoods where property values matter more than life itself, though nobody realizes that until it's too late. The call came in on a Wednesday morning in September 2020. Early autumn in New York, when the heat of summer starts breaking but tempers still run high. I was partnered with Officer Linda Barnes that day. Good cop with 12 years experience, the kind of partner who notices details other people miss. Dispatch crackled over the radio around 10:23 a.m. Unit 47, respond to 156 Hillcrest Drive. Caller reports neighbor dispute over property boundaries. Caller identifies as William Peterson. Barnes keyed the mic. A 4 to 7 responding, ETA 6 minutes. Property disputes were common in this part of Queens. Older suburban neighborhoods where lot lines had been surveyed decades ago, where families had been living next to each other for generations, where a few feet of land could represent tens of thousands of dollars in property value. Usually, these calls involved heated arguments, maybe some pushed fences or damaged gardens. Nothing that couldn't be settled with some mediation and clear documentation. We pulled up to Hillcrest Drive to find a street that looked like the American suburban dream. Well-maintained houses built in the 1960s, mature trees, sidewalks where kids rode bicycles and neighbors walked dogs. The kind of place where the biggest crime was usually someone forgetting to put their garbage cans away. William Peterson was waiting on his front porch. Mid-60s, retired, wearing work clothes like he'd been doing yard maintenance. He had that frustrated look homeowners get when they think their neighbors are taking advantage of them. "Officers, thank you for coming," Peterson said as we approached. "I need documentation of what's happening next door. Harold Mitchell has been systematically encroaching on my property for months." Barnes pulled out her notepad. "What kind of encroachment, Mr. Peterson?" "First, it was his fence. Moved it 3 feet onto my side. Then he poured a concrete pad for his shed, completely on my property. Now he's trying to claim my driveway belongs to him." Peterson led us to the property line between his house and 158 Hillcrest Drive, where his neighbor Harold Mitchell lived. The boundary was marked by a chain-link fence that did appear to be several feet inside Peterson's yard, based on the survey stakes he'd placed. "I had the property surveyed last month," Peterson explained, showing us official documentation. "The survey clearly shows Harold's fence is 3 feet onto my land, his shed foundation is entirely on my property, and he's been parking in my driveway." The property survey looked legitimate, conducted by a licensed surveyor, clearly marking the boundary line. If accurate, Mitchell had indeed been encroaching significantly on Peterson's property. "Have you tried discussing this with Mr. Mitchell?" Barnes asked. Peterson's expression darkened. "Harold claims he's been using this land for 20 years, says he has squatter's rights or something. He refuses to move anything and threatens me every time I bring it up." "What kind of threats?" "Says he'll make me regret pushing the issue, that I don't know who I'm dealing with. Yesterday, he told me accidents happen to people who don't mind their own business. That elevated the situation beyond a simple property dispute. Threats of violence required documentation and follow-up even in neighbor conflicts." "Is Mr. Mitchell home now?" I asked. "He's in his backyard. You can hear him working on something back there." We could indeed hear power tools and construction sounds coming from behind the Mitchell house. Barnes and I walked over to make contact and get Mitchell's side of the story. Harold Mitchell was in his early 70s, thin but wiry, working on what appeared to be an extension to the shed Peterson had mentioned. He looked up when we approached, and I immediately noticed something in his expression. Not surprise or concern, but calculation. "Mr. Mitchell, NYPD, we're here about a property boundary dispute with your neighbor." Mitchell wiped his hands on a rag and studied us carefully. "What's old Bill complaining about now?" "He says you've encroached on his property. Moved a fence, built a shed, been parking in his driveway." Mitchell laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Bill Peterson's been trying to steal my land since the day he moved in 15 years ago. I've been maintaining this boundary for over 20 years. He thinks he can wave some piece of paper around and take what's mine. Do you have documentation of your property lines?" "I don't need documentation. I've been working this land since before Peterson even lived here. I built that fence, I maintain that driveway, I use that shed every day. Possession is 9/10 of the law." Barnes exchanged glances with me. Both men seemed convinced they were in the right, but Peterson had recent surveyor documentation while Mitchell was claiming long-term use. "Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Peterson says you've made threats about what would happen if he pursues this issue." Mitchell's expression hardened. "I told him he should be careful about starting something he can't finish. This is my property and I'll defend it." "Sir, that sounds like a threat." "It's a fact. Some things are worth fighting for." The way Mitchell said it sent up red flags. This wasn't just neighbor frustration. There was something deeper, more dangerous in his tone. "Have you considered resolving this through mediation or civil court?" "I don't need courts. I know what's mine." We documented both sides of the dispute and advised both neighbors to avoid further contact while seeking legal resolution. But as we walked back to our patrol car, Barnes voiced what I was thinking. "This feels like more than a property dispute. There's something off about Mitchell." "Agreed. Let's check if either of them has history with the department." Back at the station, we ran background checks on both William Peterson and Harold Mitchell. Peterson came back clean. No criminal record, no prior police contacts, retired insurance adjuster who'd lived at his address for 15 years with no previous complaints. Harold Mitchell was a different story. Mitchell had a history of neighbor disputes going back decades. Multiple police calls for boundary disagreements, harassment complaints, one restraining order that had expired. But what caught our attention was a pattern. Mitchell had been involved in property disputes with 3 different neighbors over the past 20 years, and in each case the neighbor had eventually moved away. "Look at this," Barnes said, reviewing the records. 1998, dispute with neighbors at 742 Oak Street. 2003, harassment complaints from neighbors at 89 Maple Avenue. 2015, restraining order filed by neighbors at 23 Pine Road. In every case, Mitchell claimed the neighbors were encroaching on his property. And, in every case, the neighbors eventually sold and moved? All three families. Sold their houses and left within 2 years of the initial disputes. That was unusual. Property disputes were common, but most got resolved through legal channels or mediation. For multiple families to sell and move rather than fight suggested something more intimidating than simple boundary disagreements. We should contact the previous neighbors, see what they experienced. The first family, the Johnsons from Oak Street, had moved to New Jersey. When I called Mrs. Johnson, her reaction to Mitchell's name was immediate fear. Harold Mitchell? Is he still bothering people? Ma'am, we're investigating a current property dispute. Can you tell us about your experience with Mr. Mitchell? That man made our lives hell for 3 years. Started with claims about our fence being on his property, escalated to harassment, vandalism, threats. We tried going through legal channels, but he made it clear he'd make us miserable until we left. What kind of threats? He knew our schedules, where we worked, when our kids would be home alone. He'd call our employers, file false police reports, follow us when we left the house. The final straw was when we found our cat dead in our driveway, with a note saying our family could be next. My blood ran cold. Did you report that to police? We tried, but Mitchell was clever. Never any direct evidence it was him. Always plausible deniability, but we knew. Everyone in the neighborhood knew he was responsible for everything that happened to families who crossed him. The second family, the Martinez family from Maple Avenue, had a similar story. 3 years of escalating harassment, mysterious property damage, dead pets, anonymous threats. Eventually, they'd sold at a loss just to escape. Mitchell had convinced himself that he owned property that belonged to other people, Mr. Martinez told me. But it wasn't really about the property. It was about control, dominance. He enjoyed terrorizing families until they gave up and left. The third family was harder to reach. The Williamses from Pine Road had moved to Florida. But when I finally spoke with Mrs. Williams, her story was the most disturbing yet. Harold Mitchell nearly destroyed our marriage, she said. The harassment went on for 2 years. Property damage, dead animals, threatening phone calls. But the worst part was the stalking. He knew everything about our lives, our routines, our vulnerabilities. What finally made you decide to move? Our teenage daughter, Sarah, started having nightmares, couldn't sleep, was afraid to be home alone. One night she woke up screaming, said she saw someone watching her through her bedroom window. We found footprints under her window, but Mitchell claimed he'd been in his yard all evening. Did you get a restraining order? We tried, but Mitchell was careful never to do anything we could prove in court. The harassment would always happen when there were no witnesses, no direct evidence. The judge said our concerns were understandable, but not legally actionable. 3 families, 3 identical patterns of escalating harassment, 3 forced relocations. And now William Peterson was the 4th neighbor to cross Harold Mitchell's perceived property boundaries. Barnes and I returned to Hillcrest Drive that afternoon to conduct a more thorough investigation. If Mitchell was following his established pattern, Peterson could be in serious danger. Our follow-up visit to Hillcrest Drive revealed details that should have been obvious during our first response. Signs of ongoing conflict that went far beyond a simple boundary dispute. Peterson showed us damage to his property that he hadn't mentioned during our initial call. Scratches on his car that appeared deliberate. Plants in his garden that had been cut or poisoned. His garbage scattered across his lawn on multiple occasions. This has been going on for 3 months, Peterson explained. Ever since I had the property surveyed and approached Harold about the encroachment. Why didn't you mention this earlier? I thought it might be coincidence, or maybe teenagers causing trouble. But after talking to you this morning, I realized it all started when Harold got angry about the survey. Peterson showed us photographs he'd taken documenting the damage. Slashed tires, broken sprinkler heads, dead spots in his lawn where someone had poured chemicals. The pattern of damage suggested systematic harassment rather than random vandalism. Mr. Peterson, have you noticed anyone watching your house, following you when you leave? Actually, yes. Harold seems to know exactly when I come and go. He'll be working in his yard whenever I leave for errands. Always has some comment about my schedule. Barnes was taking detailed notes. Have you received any threatening communications? Anonymous letters, 3 so far. Peterson retrieved them from inside his house. I didn't think to mention them this morning. The letters were typed, untraceable, but the content was clearly threatening. References to previous neighbors who had learned to respect property boundaries, suggestions that Peterson should consider relocating before situations become unpleasant, and warnings about accidents that can happen to stubborn people. These constitute criminal threats, Barnes said. We need to document everything. As we photographed the letters and property damage, I noticed Mitchell watching us from his backyard. He wasn't trying to hide his surveillance. He wanted Peterson to know he was being observed. Mr. Peterson, we're going to need you to start documenting everything. Every incident, every sighting of Mitchell, every piece of damage. Keep a detailed log with dates and times. Is this really necessary? Can't you just make him stop? Barnes and I exchanged glances. Based on Mitchell's history, this was just the beginning. Sir, we've discovered that Mr. Mitchell has been involved in similar disputes with 3 previous neighbors. In each case, the harassment escalated over time until the neighbors moved away. Peterson's face went pale. What kind of escalation? I explained Mitchell's pattern without going into the most disturbing details. Property damage, surveillance, threats, psychological pressure designed to make life unbearable for anyone who challenged his perceived territory. We're going to increase patrols in this area and document everything Mitchell does, but you need to be extremely careful. Don't engage with him directly, don't respond to provocations, and call us immediately if anything escalates. That evening, Barnes and I did additional research into Mitchell's background. What we found painted a picture of someone who had perfected a system of legal terrorism against his neighbors. Mitchell had never been convicted of a serious crime, but he'd been involved in dozens of police calls over the years. Harassment complaints, property disputes, allegations of stalking and intimidation. The pattern was always the same: escalating pressure until neighbors gave up and moved away. He's learned exactly how far he can push without crossing lines that would result in arrest, Barnes observed. Everything he does is calculated to stay just below the threshold of criminal prosecution, except for the dead animals. That should have been prosecutable. Only if we could prove he was responsible, and Mitchell's smart enough to ensure there's never direct evidence. We requested the case files from Mitchell's previous neighbor disputes. The documentation revealed a sophisticated campaign of psychological warfare that had driven 3 families from their homes. The pattern always began with property boundary claims. Mitchell would assert ownership of land that clearly belonged to his neighbors, then escalate when challenged. Property damage, surveillance, threats, and psychological pressure would continue until the neighbors either gave up their disputed land or sold their houses entirely. It's not really about the property, Barnes said after reviewing the files. It's about power and control. Mitchell enjoys terrorizing people who can't fight back effectively. But there was something else in Mitchell's pattern that worried me. Each successive dispute had been more aggressive than the last. The harassment of the Johnson family in 1998 had been relatively mild. The Martinez family in 2003 had experienced more severe intimidation. The Williams family in 2015 had been subjected to sophisticated stalking and psychological torture. "He's escalating," I told Barnes, "learning from each dispute, becoming more effective at terrorizing neighbors." Which means Peterson could be facing the worst harassment yet. 2 days later, our fears were confirmed. Peterson called 911 at 2:17 a.m. reporting someone in his backyard. When we responded, we found evidence that someone had been systematically surveying his property. Fresh footprints around the house, examination of windows and doors, even evidence that someone had tested the security of Peterson's basement entrance. "Whoever was here wasn't trying to break in," I explained to Peterson. "They were conducting reconnaissance, learning about your security, your vulnerabilities." Peterson was shaken. "Harold? We can't prove it, but based on his history, it's likely." We found no direct evidence connecting Mitchell to the intrusion, but security cameras from a house across the street had captured a figure moving through Peterson's yard at 1:45 a.m. The image was too dark to identify the person, but the height and build were consistent with Mitchell. The next morning, Mitchell was working in his yard when Peterson left for errands, making a point of being visible and establishing an alibi for the time period when the surveillance had occurred. "He's playing games," Barnes said as we reviewed the security footage. "Wants Peterson to know he's being watched, but careful not to provide evidence that could be used against him." Barnes contacted the detective division to request assistance with what was clearly becoming a stalking case. Detective James Rodriguez from the 109th agreed to take the case and bring additional resources to the investigation. Rodriguez had 8 years' experience with stalking and harassment cases. His review of Mitchell's history and the current pattern of behavior confirmed our concerns. "This is textbook predatory behavior," Rodriguez explained during our briefing. "Mitchell has developed a system for psychologically terrorizing neighbors until they either give up disputed property or abandon their homes entirely. What's the legal approach? Document everything, build a comprehensive case file, and wait for Mitchell to make a mistake that gives us grounds for arrest. But meanwhile, Peterson is going to experience escalating harassment." Rodriguez explained Mitchell's likely strategy based on his previous neighbor disputes: systematic property damage, surveillance, threats, and psychological pressure designed to make Peterson feel unsafe in his own home. The goal is always the same: make life so unpleasant that the neighbor chooses to move rather than continue fighting. And if Peterson doesn't move, Rodriguez's expression was grim. Based on the escalating pattern from Mitchell's previous disputes, we could be looking at serious violence. That afternoon, we installed additional security measures around Peterson's property: motion-activated cameras, improved lighting, and a direct alarm connection to our dispatch center. But we also knew that Mitchell had 20 years of experience in conducting harassment campaigns below the threshold of criminal prosecution. Whatever he planned to do to Peterson, he would be careful to avoid evidence that could be used against him in court. The question wasn't whether Mitchell would escalate his harassment of Peterson. Based on his history, escalation was inevitable. The question was how far he would go, and whether we could stop him before someone got seriously hurt. The escalation began 3 days after we installed security measures around Peterson's property. Mitchell's response was swift, calculated, and designed to demonstrate that our protective measures were inadequate. Peterson called at 6:45 a.m., reporting that someone had been on his property again, but this time they'd left a message. Painted in red on his garage door were the words, "Surveys don't change facts." When Barnes and I arrived, we found something more disturbing than simple vandalism. The paint was still wet, meaning whoever had done this had been there recently. possibly while Peterson was home sleeping. The security cameras didn't capture anything, Peterson said, his voice shaking. Whoever did this knew exactly where the cameras were positioned. We reviewed the footage from all angles. The cameras had recorded several hours of normal evening activity, then a gap of 15 minutes where all feeds went dark simultaneously. Someone disabled the cameras, did the graffiti, then reactivated them, I explained. This required detailed knowledge of the security system and professional-level skill. Barnes was examining the surveillance equipment. The cameras weren't damaged or obviously tampered with. Someone found a way to temporarily interrupt the power supply. Detective Rodriguez arrived within 30 minutes. His examination of the scene revealed the sophisticated nature of the harassment campaign. "This isn't random vandalism," Rodriguez explained. "Someone spent significant time learning about Peterson's security measures, then developed a plan to circumvent them. Mitchell? Almost certainly, but he's been careful not to leave evidence. The paint was applied with gloves, no fingerprints. The electrical work to disable the cameras was done by someone with professional knowledge." Rodriguez explained that Mitchell's previous neighbor disputes had shown similar escalation patterns. Initial property damage would be followed by increasingly sophisticated harassment, designed to demonstrate the victim's vulnerability. "The message isn't just about the property survey," Rodriguez continued. "It's psychological warfare. Mitchell is showing Peterson that security measures won't protect him." That afternoon, we conducted surveillance on Mitchell's house while Rodriguez interviewed Peterson about his daily routines, work schedule, and personal vulnerabilities. What Peterson revealed painted a picture of someone whose life was being systematically invaded and documented by a predatory neighbor. "Harold knows when I leave for work, when I return, what grocery store I use, where I go to church," Peterson explained. "Yesterday he made a comment about my doctor's appointment, but I never told him about it." "How could he know about your medical appointments?" "I have no idea, but he knew I'd been to see Dr. Williams about my blood pressure. Made some comment about hoping my health would hold up during stressful times." Rodriguez took detailed notes. "Has Mitchell mentioned other personal information he shouldn't know?" "Last week, he commented on my niece visiting from Chicago, but I never told him about her visit, and she stayed inside the house the whole time." This suggested that Mitchell had access to Peterson's phone communications, mail, or other private information sources. The level of surveillance indicated sophisticated stalking methods. "Mr. Peterson, we need to examine your house for surveillance devices. It's possible Mitchell has planted listening devices or cameras inside your home." The search revealed 2 hidden microphones, one in Peterson's living room behind a picture frame, another in his kitchen inside a decorative plant. Both were professional-grade devices that would have required inside access to install. "How did he get inside my house?" "Unknown, but both devices were placed in locations that would capture most conversations and phone calls." Barnes contacted crime scene technicians to process the surveillance devices for fingerprints or other evidence. But as expected, Mitchell had been careful not to leave identifying traces. "The devices were handled with gloves, no prints," the technician reported. But the installation required detailed knowledge of the house layout and electrical systems. Rodriguez explained the implications of finding surveillance devices inside Peterson's home. "This elevates the case to felony stalking and illegal surveillance. If we can prove Mitchell installed these devices, we can arrest him. But we can't prove it. Not without direct evidence. The devices could have been installed by anyone with access to your house. That evening, we set up our own surveillance operation. If Mitchell was monitoring Peterson's house, we would monitor Mitchell's house. Officers stationed in unmarked vehicles observed Mitchell's property, while Rodriguez and I coordinated with federal agencies experienced in stalking investigations. What we learned was that Mitchell's harassment campaigns represented a sophisticated form of domestic terrorism that existing laws were poorly equipped to address. He's developed methods that stay just below criminal prosecution thresholds, Rodriguez explained. Everything is calculated to cause maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. The surveillance devices found in Peterson's house provided evidence of criminal activity, but proving Mitchell was responsible required connecting him to the installation. "We know he did it, but proving it in court is different," Rodriguez said. Mitchell has 20 years of experience avoiding legal consequences for his harassment campaigns. 2 days later, Mitchell's psychological campaign escalated again. Peterson woke to find his front lawn covered with dead flowers arranged in the shape of a question mark. "The message is clear," Rodriguez explained as we documented the scene. Mitchell is asking whether Peterson understands how vulnerable he is. The dead flowers had been arranged during the night, but once again, the security cameras had been temporarily disabled during the incident. "He's demonstrating that security measures are useless," Rodriguez continued, "that he can access Peterson's property whenever he chooses." Barnes was examining the flowers. "These aren't random dead plants, they're funeral flowers, the kind used for cemetery arrangements." The implication was unmistakable. Mitchell was suggesting that Peterson's situation could become terminal if he continued to challenge the property boundary claims. "We need to consider relocating Peterson," Rodriguez said. Mitchell's pattern suggests the harassment will continue escalating until Peterson either gives up the disputed property or leaves entirely. "What about arresting Mitchell? On what charges?" "We have circumstantial evidence, but nothing that would stand up in court. Mitchell has been careful to avoid direct prosecution." That afternoon, we met with Peterson to discuss his options. The harassment campaign was clearly affecting his health and mental state. "I haven't slept properly in 2 weeks, Peterson explained. "Every sound at night makes me think someone's outside. I'm afraid to leave the house, afraid to stay home. Have you considered temporarily relocating while we build a case against Mitchell?" Peterson's response was immediate. "If I leave, Harold wins. He gets to keep the property he's stolen, and I lose my home. That's exactly what he wants." Rodriguez explained Mitchell's history with previous neighbors. 3 families have faced similar harassment. All eventually sold their houses and moved away. "I'm not leaving. This is my home, my property. Harold Mitchell doesn't get to terrorize me into abandoning what's mine." Peterson's determination was admirable, but potentially dangerous. Based on Mitchell's escalating pattern, the harassment would likely become more severe if Peterson refused to be intimidated. "Sir, we understand your position, but we're concerned about your safety. Mitchell's previous disputes have involved serious threats and possible violence. Then arrest him. We're working on building a case, but Mitchell has been careful to avoid leaving evidence that would support criminal charges." That evening, our surveillance team observed Mitchell conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of Peterson's property. Using night vision equipment, he systematically observed Peterson's house from multiple angles, documenting security measures and routine activities. But Mitchell was careful to stay on his own property while conducting surveillance, making his activities technically legal, even though their purpose was clearly harassment. "He's gathering intelligence for the next phase," Rodriguez observed. "Whatever Mitchell plans to do, he's preparing carefully." The question was whether we could anticipate Mitchell's next move and prevent escalation to violence, or whether Peterson would become the 4th neighbor to be driven away by Mitchell's campaign of terror. Mitchell's reconnaissance activities became more systematic over the following days. Our surveillance team documented him observing Peterson's house at regular intervals, noting patterns in Peterson's daily routine and security measures. But Mitchell's intelligence gathering extended beyond simple observation. We discovered evidence that he was researching Peterson's personal life, work history, and financial situation. Detective Rodriguez received a call from Peterson's employer, reporting that someone had been asking questions about Peterson's work schedule and job performance. A man, claiming to be Peterson's neighbor, called asking about Peterson's reliability and whether he'd been missing work due to stress. Peterson's supervisor explained. Said he was concerned about Peterson's mental health. Did he identify himself? Said his name was Harold, claimed he was worried about Peterson, and wanted to know if his work was being affected by personal problems. This represented a new escalation in Mitchell's harassment campaign. He was now attempting to damage Peterson's professional reputation and employment security. Rodriguez contacted Peterson to warn him about Mitchell's workplace interference. Harold called my boss? Peterson was incredulous. What business does he have contacting my employer? None, but it's part of his pattern. Mitchell wants to isolate you, damage your support systems, make you feel like you have nowhere to turn. Can you stop him from calling my work? We can document it as harassment, but unless your employer files a complaint, it's difficult to prosecute. Rodriguez explained Mitchell's strategy based on his analysis of the previous neighbor disputes. Mitchell systematically attacks every aspect of his targets' lives: professional relationships, family connections, community standing. The goal is to make continued residence so unpleasant that moving becomes the only viable option. That afternoon, we discovered that Mitchell's intelligence gathering had extended to Peterson's financial information. Peterson received a call from his bank reporting suspicious inquiries about his account. Someone called claiming to be Peterson, asking about his mortgage payments and account balances, the bank security officer explained. When we asked for verification information, they hung up. Could the caller have been Mitchell? Possibly, but we can't be certain. The call came from a blocked number. Rodriguez added this to the growing file of harassment incidents. Mitchell is building a comprehensive profile of your vulnerabilities. Financial pressure, workplace stress, social isolation. He's looking for ways to attack your stability. The scope of Mitchell's intelligence gathering suggested sophisticated planning for an extended campaign of psychological pressure. This isn't impulsive harassment, Rodriguez explained. Mitchell is conducting systematic intelligence operations like a professional private investigator. Barnes and I increased our surveillance of Mitchell's activities. What we observed revealed someone who had perfected the art of legal harassment over decades of practice. Mitchell maintained detailed logs of Peterson's activities, photographed Peterson's visitors, and documented everything that happened around Peterson's property. He's building his own case file, Barnes observed, documenting everything Peterson does, looking for anything he can use as leverage. But Mitchell's surveillance activities were conducted carefully to stay within legal boundaries. He observed from his own property, used telephoto lenses that didn't constitute trespass, and avoided direct contact that could be characterized as stalking. Mitchell has learned exactly how to maximize harassment while minimizing legal exposure, Rodriguez said. 20 years of neighbor disputes have taught him how to terrorize people without getting arrested. The psychological impact on Peterson was becoming severe. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, paranoia about every phone call and unexpected visitor. I can't live like this, Peterson told us during a follow-up interview. Harold has turned my life into a nightmare, and you can't do anything to stop him. Rodriguez tried to explain the legal constraints on law enforcement intervention. We're documenting everything Mitchell does, building a comprehensive case file. But stalking and harassment laws require proof of direct threats or criminal activity. What about the surveillance devices in my house? We know Mitchell planted them, but proving it in court requires evidence that would satisfy a jury beyond reasonable doubt. Peterson's frustration was understandable. Mitchell was systematically destroying his quality of life using methods that stayed just below the threshold of criminal prosecution. So, Harold can do whatever he wants, as long as he's careful not to leave fingerprints. Not whatever he wants, but he's learned to exploit gaps in harassment laws. That evening, Mitchell's intelligence gathering took another disturbing turn. Peterson received a phone call from someone claiming to be conducting a survey about neighborhood safety. The caller asked detailed questions about my security system, my daily routine, whether I felt safe living alone, Peterson reported. When I asked what organization was conducting the survey, they hung up. Rodriguez traced the call to a prepaid phone purchased with cash, untraceable to any individual. Mitchell is using sophisticated techniques to gather intelligence while maintaining anonymity, Rodriguez explained. Professional-level social engineering designed to extract personal information. The fake survey call was concerning because it suggested Mitchell was escalating his intelligence-gathering operations. What kind of information was he trying to get? Details about your security measures, your personal routines, your vulnerabilities. The kind of information someone would need to plan more serious harassment or even violence. Rodriguez contacted federal agencies with expertise in stalking investigations. What they told him was alarming. Mitchell's methods are consistent with predatory stalking patterns that often escalate to violence, Special Agent Diana Foster from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit explained. The systematic intelligence gathering, the psychological pressure campaign, the isolation tactics, these are precursors to more serious criminal activity. How serious? Based on similar cases, we could be looking at escalation to physical assault, home invasion, or even murder if the target doesn't comply with the stalker's demands. Foster reviewed Mitchell's case file and confirmed our concerns about escalation. Mitchell's pattern shows increasing sophistication and aggression with each successive neighbor dispute. The harassment campaigns have become more elaborate, more psychologically damaging, more difficult to prosecute. What's the likely next step? Direct confrontation, physical intimidation, or staged incidents designed to terrify the target into compliance. That night, our surveillance team observed Mitchell conducting what appeared to be operational planning around Peterson's property. Using night vision equipment and detailed measurements, he systematically surveyed approaches to Peterson's house. He's planning something, Barnes observed. This isn't casual surveillance, it's operational reconnaissance. Rodriguez decided to increase police protection for Peterson while we developed strategies for arresting Mitchell before he could escalate to violence. We need to anticipate Mitchell's next move and be ready to intervene, Rodriguez explained. Based on his history and current behavior, Peterson is in immediate danger. But predicting Mitchell's specific plans was challenging. 20 years of experience had taught him to vary his methods, avoid patterns that law enforcement could anticipate. Mitchell has successfully terrorized 3 families into abandoning their homes, Rodriguez said. He knows exactly how much pressure to apply, when to escalate, how to stay below prosecution thresholds. The question was whether Peterson would become Mitchell's 4th victim, or whether we could find a way to stop a harassment campaign that had been perfected over 2 decades of legal terrorism. The escalation we'd been anticipating came on a Friday evening in October. Peterson called 911 at 8:42 p.m. reporting that Mitchell was in his backyard, standing near his kitchen window, staring into his house. Barnes and I responded within 4 minutes. When we arrived, Mitchell was gone, but Peterson was visibly shaken. He was just standing there, watching me eat dinner, Peterson explained. When I got up to call police, he walked away slowly, like he wasn't concerned about being caught. We found footprints in the soft ground beneath Peterson's kitchen window, but Mitchell was now in his own backyard, establishing an alibi by working on his shed under bright lights. He wants me to know he can get right up to my house whenever he chooses, Peterson said. The message is that my security measures are meaningless. Detective Rodriguez arrived to coordinate our response. This was the most direct confrontation Mitchell had attempted, suggesting he was preparing for the final phase of his harassment campaign. Mitchell is testing Peterson's reactions and our response time, Rodriguez explained. He's gathering intelligence about our protective capabilities. We approached Mitchell in his backyard to document his activities and establish his awareness that he was under police observation. Mr. Mitchell, we're investigating a report of someone on your neighbor's property. Mitchell looked up from his work with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Someone on Bill's property. That's terrible. I hope nobody was trying to break in. Where have you been for the past 30 minutes? Right here, working on my shed. I've got lights up, been making noise with power tools. Anyone in the neighborhood could have seen me. Mitchell had positioned himself to be visible from multiple houses, creating witnesses to support his alibi. But the timing suggested he'd established his presence immediately after retreating from Peterson's property. Did you see anyone suspicious in the area? No, but I've been focused on my work. You know how important it is to maintain your property properly. Mitchell's emphasis on property maintenance was a subtle reminder of his boundary dispute with Peterson. Even while providing an alibi, he was reinforcing his territorial claims. Rodriguez documented Mitchell's statements and the physical evidence, but knew it would be difficult to prove Mitchell had been on Peterson's property. The footprints under Peterson's window could belong to anyone, Rodriguez explained later. Mitchell's alibi is solid, and we can't prove he was the person Peterson saw. But the psychological impact on Peterson was severe. The knowledge that Mitchell could approach his house undetected, observe him through windows, then disappear before police arrived had shattered his sense of security. I can't stay here, Peterson told us. Harold has made it clear he can get to me whenever he wants. What's to stop him from breaking in while I'm sleeping? Rodriguez tried to reassure Peterson while acknowledging the legitimate nature of his fears. We're increasing patrols, installing additional security measures, and building a case against Mitchell. But your safety is the priority. A case based on what? You said yourself you can't prove Harold was on my property. We're documenting a pattern of harassment that will eventually provide grounds for arrest. But these investigations take time. Peterson's frustration was understandable. Mitchell had been terrorizing him for months, using methods designed to stay below criminal prosecution thresholds. 2 days later, Mitchell's harassment took a new form. Peterson woke to find a surveyor's stake driven into his front lawn with a note attached. Proper boundaries will be enforced. The stake was positioned exactly on the property line claimed by Mitchell's disputed boundary assertions. The message was clear. Mitchell considered himself authorized to enforce his version of the property boundaries. This is escalating from harassment to territorial enforcement, Rodriguez observed as we documented the incident. Mitchell is claiming authority to control Peterson's property. Barnes examined the surveyor's stake. This is professional-grade equipment, the kind used by licensed surveyors. Where would Mitchell get access to this? Research into Mitchell's background revealed that he'd worked as a surveyor's assistant in the 1980s before being fired for falsifying boundary measurements. His knowledge of surveying techniques explained his sophisticated approach to property disputes. Mitchell has professional knowledge of property boundaries and surveying methods, Rodriguez explained. He knows exactly how to manipulate boundary disputes to his advantage. But the surveyor's stake represented more than symbolic territorial marking. Mitchell was escalating his claims to include active enforcement of his disputed boundaries. He's not just claiming the property anymore, Rodriguez continued. He's acting like he has authority to enforce his claims. That afternoon, Mitchell began construction of what appeared to be a permanent fence along his claimed property line. The fence would encroach 3 feet onto Peterson's property, effectively seizing the disputed land through force. Peterson called police to report the illegal construction, but Mitchell had researched zoning regulations and was careful to comply with technical requirements. The fence meets all municipal building codes, the zoning inspector explained when we contacted him. Unless there's a legal determination about the property boundary, I can't stop construction. But the fence is being built on Peterson's property according to his survey. That's a civil matter for the courts to resolve. My authority is limited to building code violations. Mitchell had exploited another gap in legal protection. Property boundary disputes were civil matters, not criminal, even when one party was actively seizing disputed land. Harold is stealing my property in broad daylight and nobody can stop him. Peterson was incredulous. Rodriguez explained the limitations of criminal law in property disputes. Unless Mitchell uses threats or violence, constructing a fence is a civil matter. You'll need to file a lawsuit to establish legal ownership of the disputed land. How long will that take? Property litigation can take years. Meanwhile, Mitchell's fence establishes physical control of the disputed area. Peterson retained a lawyer to file an emergency injunction against Mitchell's fence construction. But the legal process was slow, while Mitchell's construction was immediate. Within 3 days, Mitchell had completed a substantial fence that effectively seized the disputed property. Peterson's lawyer filed for an emergency court order, but the earliest hearing date was 2 weeks away. Mitchell has temporarily won, Rodriguez acknowledged. He seized physical control of the disputed property, while legal resolution is pending. But Mitchell's fence construction represented more than territorial acquisition. It was a psychological dominance demonstration designed to show Peterson that legal protection was inadequate. The fence isn't just about the property, Rodriguez explained. It's about proving that Mitchell has more power than Peterson, more ability to control the situation. The psychological impact was devastating. Peterson had spent months being terrorized by harassment, surveillance, and threats. Now Mitchell had physically seized his property while Peterson was powerless to stop him. Harold has won, Peterson said during our follow-up interview. He's taken my land, terrorized my family, destroyed my peace of mind. And the law can't protect me. Rodriguez tried to maintain Peterson's confidence in the legal process while acknowledging the legitimate nature of his concerns. Mitchell has gained temporary advantage, but the courts will ultimately resolve the property boundary issue. Will they? Harold has been doing this for 20 years, and he's never lost a dispute. That was true. Mitchell's 3 previous neighbor disputes had all ended with the neighbors abandoning their claims and moving away rather than continuing to fight. Previous families gave up because they couldn't endure the harassment, Rodriguez explained. But we're building a criminal case against Mitchell that will change the dynamic. Based on what evidence? You've been investigating for months without finding anything you can prosecute. Rodriguez's confidence was undermined by the reality of Mitchell's sophisticated harassment methods. Every action was calculated to stay below criminal prosecution thresholds, while maximizing psychological impact. That evening, our surveillance team observed Mitchell celebrating his fence completion by hosting what appeared to be a party in his backyard. Multiple neighbors attended, suggesting he had community support for his boundary claims. Mitchell has been building relationships with other neighbors, Barnes observed, positioning himself as the victim of Peterson's unreasonable demands. This represented another sophisticated element of Mitchell's strategy. While terrorizing Peterson privately, he maintained a public persona as a reasonable neighbor defending his legitimate property rights. He's isolated Peterson from community support while building his own network of allies, Rodriguez said. Classic predatory behavior designed to ensure the victim has nowhere to turn for help. The combination of legal obstacles, community isolation, and ongoing harassment was having the intended effect. Peterson was beginning to consider abandoning his property rather than continuing to fight. "Maybe Harold is right," Peterson said during a private conversation with Rodriguez. "Maybe I should just accept his boundaries and try to live peacefully. Sir, giving in to Mitchell's demands will only encourage further harassment, and you'll be abandoning property that legally belongs to you. But fighting back hasn't worked. Harold keeps escalating and you can't stop him." Rodriguez realized that Peterson was approaching the psychological breaking point that had caused Mitchell's 3 previous neighbors to abandon their homes. "We're close to having enough evidence for criminal charges," Rodriguez assured Peterson. "Don't give up just when we're making progress." But privately, Rodriguez acknowledged that Mitchell's harassment campaign was succeeding. Peterson was being systematically broken down through months of psychological pressure that existing laws were poorly equipped to address. The question was whether we could arrest Mitchell before Peterson became the 4th neighbor to be driven away by his campaign of legal terrorism. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning in November. Peterson called 911 at 4:33 a.m. in a panic, reporting that someone was trying to break into his house. Barnes and I responded with full emergency backup, expecting to find Mitchell attempting a home invasion. Instead, we found Peterson barricaded inside his house, convinced that sounds from Mitchell's property were an imminent attack. "He's coming for me," Peterson said when we finally convinced him to open his door. "I heard him moving around outside, testing my doors and windows." We searched Peterson's property thoroughly, but found no evidence of intrusion attempts. The sounds Peterson had heard were coming from Mitchell's property, where he was conducting what appeared to be normal early morning yard work. "Mr. Peterson, there's no evidence anyone tried to enter your house," I explained gently. "The sounds you heard were from Mitchell's yard, but he wasn't on your property." Peterson was clearly suffering from severe sleep deprivation and anxiety. Months of harassment had taken a psychological toll that was affecting his perception of reality. "You don't understand," Peterson insisted. "Harold is planning something. All the surveillance, the fence, the intimidation. It's building towards something worse." Detective Rodriguez arrived to assess Peterson's mental state and the security situation. What he found was someone approaching complete psychological breakdown. "Mr. Peterson, when did you last sleep through the night?" "I can't remember. Every sound makes me think Harold is outside. I lie awake listening, waiting for him to make his move." Rodriguez recognized the symptoms of prolonged psychological harassment. Mitchell's campaign was achieving its intended effect of destroying Peterson's mental stability. "Sir, I'm going to recommend that you consider staying with family or friends for a few days. You need rest, and you need distance from this situation. If I leave, Harold wins. He gets my property, my home, everything I've worked for. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about your health and safety." But Peterson's refusal to leave played directly into Mitchell's strategy. The harassment was designed to create a choice between psychological destruction and abandoning the disputed property. Rodriguez contacted mental health professionals experienced with stalking victims. Their assessment confirmed his concerns about Peterson's psychological state. Mr. Peterson is experiencing symptoms consistent with prolonged psychological trauma, Dr. Sarah Williams explained after her evaluation. Sleep deprivation, hypervigilance, paranoid ideation. He needs immediate intervention. Can he make rational decisions about his safety? His judgment is compromised by stress and exhaustion. He's fixated on the property dispute to the exclusion of his personal well-being. Dr. Williams recommended immediate psychiatric hospitalization, but Peterson refused voluntary commitment. Legal involuntary commitment required evidence of immediate danger to himself or others. "I'm not crazy," Peterson insisted. "Harold Mitchell is terrorizing me and everyone thinks I'm imagining it." Rodriguez tried to balance Peterson's autonomy with concern for his safety. "Sir, nobody thinks you're imagining the harassment, but your reaction to stress is affecting your judgment." "My reaction? Harold has been stalking me for months, stolen my property, threatened my safety. How am I supposed to react?" Peterson's response was understandable, but his psychological state was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of sleep deprivation, anxiety, and social isolation was creating conditions for complete breakdown. That afternoon, Peterson's behavior became more erratic. He called 911 3 times, reporting suspicious activity that investigating officers couldn't confirm. "Peterson is losing touch with reality," Barnes observed after the third false alarm. "Mitchell's psychological warfare is working." Rodriguez met with Peterson's family to discuss intervention options. Peterson's sister from New Jersey offered temporary housing, but Peterson refused to leave his property. "William has always been stubborn," his sister explained. "But I've never seen him like this. He's obsessed with the neighbor situation to the point where he can't function normally. Has he talked about harming himself or others? He talks about making Harold pay for what he's done. I'm worried he might do something desperate." This raised new concerns about Peterson's potential for violence. Victims of prolonged harassment sometimes escalate to aggressive retaliation when legal remedies prove inadequate. Rodriguez increased surveillance on both Peterson and Mitchell. If Peterson was planning retaliation, we needed to intervene before violence occurred. Stalking victims often reach a breaking point where they feel violence is their only option, Rodriguez explained to our task force. Peterson has been pushed to psychological limits, and his judgment is compromised. That evening, our surveillance team observed Peterson conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance of Mitchell's property. Using binoculars and a camera with telephoto lens, Peterson systematically observed Mitchell's house and yard. "Peterson is now stalking Mitchell," Barnes reported. "The victim has become the aggressor." This role reversal was concerning because it played directly into Mitchell's strategy. If Peterson escalated to harassment or violence, Mitchell could claim victim status and possibly avoid prosecution for his own months of terrorizing behavior. Rodriguez approached Peterson to warn him about the legal consequences of retaliatory harassment. "Mr. Peterson, we've observed you conducting surveillance of Mitchell's property. That could constitute stalking if it continues. Harold has been stalking me for months, and you haven't arrested him. Now I'm the criminal for watching back. Sir, I understand your frustration, but retaliating with your own harassment will only hurt your case." "What case?" "You've been investigating Harold for months without filing charges. He's stolen my property, terrorized my family, destroyed my life, and you want me to just accept it?" Peterson's anger was understandable, but his escalating behavior was dangerous for everyone involved. We're still building a case against Mitchell, but it takes time to develop evidence that will stand up in court. How much time? Harold has been doing this for 20 years, and he's never been prosecuted. Why should I believe this time will be different? Rodriguez couldn't provide assurances because Mitchell's harassment methods were specifically designed to avoid criminal prosecution. 2 days later, Peterson's retaliation escalated. Mitchell called police reporting that someone had vandalized his fence with spray paint messages, "Thief" and "Land Stealer," painted in large red letters. When we investigated, Peterson didn't deny responsibility. "Harold stole my property and built that fence on my land. I was marking stolen property." Sir, vandalism is a criminal offense regardless of property disputes. So is theft, but Harold hasn't been arrested for stealing my land. Rodriguez faced a difficult decision. Peterson had clearly committed vandalism, but arresting him would make him the first person prosecuted in a situation where Mitchell had been conducting months of sophisticated harassment. "Mr. Peterson, I'm going to issue a warning for the vandalism, but any further retaliation will result in arrest. So, Harold can terrorize me indefinitely, but if I fight back, I get arrested?" "Sir, we're working to build a case against Mitchell, but you can't take the law into your own hands." But Peterson had reached the psychological breaking point that Mitchell had been methodically creating through months of calculated harassment. The question was whether Peterson would escalate to serious violence or whether we could finally find grounds to arrest Mitchell before the situation exploded into tragedy. The explosion came 3 nights later. Peterson called 911 at 11:47 p.m. reporting shots fired in his neighborhood. When Barnes and I arrived, we found a scene that confirmed our worst fears about the escalating conflict. Mitchell's fence had been destroyed by what appeared to be sledgehammer damage. Fence posts were broken, chain link was torn down, and wooden sections were splintered. But more disturbing was evidence of gunfire. Bullet holes in Mitchell's shed and his house siding. Peterson was in his backyard, holding a baseball bat, clearly agitated and not fully coherent. "He came for me," Peterson said when we approached. Harold finally made his move, so I defended myself. "Mr. Peterson, drop the bat and step away from the fence." "That's my fence on my property. Harold built it on my land and I tore it down." Barnes called for backup and medical assistance while I tried to de-escalate the situation. "Sir, we need you to put down the bat and explain what happened. Harold's been terrorizing me for months and you couldn't stop him, so I stopped him myself." We found Mitchell inside his house, shaken but uninjured. His account of events painted a different picture than Peterson's version. "I heard someone destroying my fence around 11:30, Mitchell explained. "When I came outside to investigate, Peterson started shooting at me. I ran back inside and called police." "Where's the gun that was used?" "I don't know. Peterson was holding a bat when you arrived, but the shots came from somewhere on his property." We searched Peterson's house and found a .38 revolver in his kitchen drawer. Ballistics testing would determine if it matched the bullets fired at Mitchell's property. Detective Rodriguez arrived to coordinate the investigation. The scene clearly showed escalation from harassment to property destruction to attempted violence. "Peterson finally snapped," Rodriguez assessed after reviewing the evidence. Months of psychological pressure led to violent retaliation. Peterson was arrested for property destruction and reckless endangerment. The gun charge would depend on ballistics results and whether we could prove he'd fired the shots. But as we processed the scene, inconsistencies in the evidence began emerging. The damage to Mitchell's fence was extensive and appeared to require significant time to complete. but Mitchell claimed he'd heard the destruction beginning around 11:30 p.m., and Peterson had called police at 11:47 p.m. 17 minutes to destroy this much fence, Barnes questioned. That's barely enough time, especially if Peterson was also shooting at Mitchell. The bullet trajectory analysis revealed another inconsistency. The shots fired at Mitchell's house came from an angle that didn't match Peterson's position when we arrived. The bullets were fired from a location about 30 feet southeast of where we found Peterson, the crime scene technician reported. If Peterson fired those shots, he moved between shooting and when police arrived. But Peterson's mental state when we arrived suggested he'd been in the same location for some time, not moving around his property. Rodriguez interviewed both men separately to clarify the sequence of events. Peterson's account was confused and inconsistent. He admitted destroying the fence but couldn't clearly explain the timeline or his own actions. I heard Harold coming for me, so I went outside to defend my property, Peterson said. The fence was on my land, so I tore it down. What about the gunshots? I heard shots, but I was focused on the fence. Maybe Harold was shooting at me. Peterson's confusion could have been due to stress, intoxication, or mental health issues. But it could also indicate that his memory of events was genuinely unclear. Mitchell's account was more detailed, but contained elements that didn't match the physical evidence. I heard Peterson destroying my fence, so I went outside to stop him, Mitchell explained. When he saw me, he pulled out a gun and started shooting. I ran back inside and called police. Did you see Peterson fire the shots? It was dark, but the shots came from his direction. Where exactly were you when the shots were fired? Mitchell's description of his position didn't match the bullet trajectory analysis. If he'd been where he claimed, the shots would have come from a different angle. Rodriguez suspected that neither man was telling the complete truth about the incident. Both accounts have inconsistencies, Rodriguez explained to Barnes and me. Either they're both lying, or neither of them understands what actually happened. The ballistics report provided partial answers. The bullets recovered from Mitchell's property had been fired from Peterson's .38 revolver, but the gun had been recently cleaned, suggesting someone had attempted to remove fingerprint or forensic evidence. Peterson fired the shots, but the weapon was cleaned afterward, Rodriguez said. That suggests premeditation rather than spontaneous retaliation. But Peterson's mental state and confused recollection didn't support premeditated violence. Someone experiencing psychological breakdown was unlikely to carefully clean a weapon after use. Unless someone else cleaned the gun, Barnes suggested. That possibility opened disturbing new scenarios. If a third party had been involved in the incident, both Peterson and Mitchell could have been manipulated or misled about what actually happened. Rodriguez expanded the investigation to include possible involvement by other parties. Canvass of neighbors revealed that several people had heard the commotion but hadn't seen the actual events. Mrs. Davidson across the street heard the fence being destroyed around 11:15, Rodriguez reported. But she heard gunshots earlier, around 11 p.m. before the fence destruction began. This timeline contradicted both Peterson's and Mitchell's accounts. If shots were fired before the fence destruction, neither man's version of events could be accurate. Further investigation revealed evidence of a more complex scenario than simple retaliation by Peterson. Footprints around Mitchell's property suggested that at least 3 people had been present during the incident. The prints included Peterson's boots, Mitchell's shoes, and a third set that didn't match either man. Someone else was here, Rodriguez concluded. Both Peterson and Mitchell may have been victims of manipulation by a third party. The third person's identity remained unclear, but their presence suggested the incident had been orchestrated rather than spontaneous. Why would someone manipulate Peterson and Mitchell into violent confrontation? Barnes asked. Rodriguez had a theory based on his analysis of the escalating neighbor dispute. If Peterson and Mitchell both end up arrested or forced to move, someone else benefits. The property dispute becomes irrelevant if neither party remains to pursue their claims. Who would benefit from both neighbors being removed? Someone interested in acquiring both properties at reduced prices due to the conflict history. Investigation into recent real estate activity in the neighborhood revealed that a development company had been quietly purchasing properties on Hillcrest Drive over the past year. The company had approached several homeowners with offers to purchase, but both Peterson and Mitchell had refused to sell due to their boundary dispute. A development company would benefit significantly if both Peterson and Mitchell were forced to abandon their properties, Rodriguez explained, especially if legal troubles reduced the sale prices. But proving that a development company had orchestrated violence between neighbors would require evidence of direct involvement. The investigation was becoming more complex than a simple neighbor dispute escalated to violence. We were potentially dealing with criminal conspiracy designed to manipulate property disputes for commercial advantage. The investigation into the development company led to revelations that transformed our understanding of the entire neighbor dispute. What we'd been treating as escalating harassment between Peterson and Mitchell was actually a sophisticated manipulation designed to force both men from their properties. Rodriguez contacted the Financial Crimes Unit to examine the business practices of Heritage Development Corporation, the company that had been purchasing properties in the neighborhood. Detective Lisa Wang from Financial Crimes reviewed Heritage Development's activities and found patterns consistent with organized real estate fraud. Heritage has been systematically acquiring properties in targeted neighborhoods through harassment campaigns designed to force owners to sell below market value, Wang explained during our joint briefing. How does the harassment work? They identify properties they want to acquire, then orchestrate conflicts between neighbors to make the area appear unstable and dangerous. Property values drop, owners become desperate to sell, and Heritage swoops in with lowball offers. Wang showed us documentation of Heritage Development's activities in 3 other neighborhoods where similar neighbor disputes had resulted in multiple forced sales. In each case, the pattern is identical. Escalating harassment between neighbors, police involvement, property damage, eventually violence that makes continued residence unbearable for everyone involved. Are the neighbors aware they're being manipulated? Usually not. Heritage recruits one neighbor to harass others, but the recruited harasser believes they're acting on their own motivations. This explained Mitchell's sophisticated harassment methods and his success in avoiding prosecution. He wasn't acting independently. He was being guided by professionals who understood legal loopholes and psychological pressure techniques. Mitchell has been working for Heritage Development? Rodriguez asked. Almost certainly, though he may not realize the full scope of the operation. Heritage typically recruits neighbors with legitimate grievances, then gradually escalates their conflicts through training and financial incentives. Wang showed us financial records indicating that Mitchell had received payments from Heritage Development disguised as consulting fees for property boundary assessments. Over the past 2 years, Mitchell has received over $40,000 from Heritage for consulting services, Wang reported. The payments correspond exactly with his harassment campaigns against Peterson. So Mitchell was being paid to terrorize Peterson? Paid and trained. Heritage provides psychological manipulation techniques, legal advice for avoiding prosecution, and financial motivation for sustained harassment campaigns. This explained Mitchell's sophisticated methods and his knowledge of legal loopholes. He'd been coached by professionals experienced in property acquisition through intimidation. But the financial records also revealed something disturbing about the recent violence. Mitchell had received a large payment from Heritage Development just 3 days before the fence destruction incident. $50,000, labeled as Project Completion Bonus, Wang noted. The timing suggests Heritage knew the situation was about to escalate to violence. Rodriguez suspected that Heritage had orchestrated the violent confrontation to ensure both Peterson and Mitchell would be forced to abandon their properties. If both neighbors end up arrested or psychologically destroyed, Heritage can acquire both properties at distressed prices, Rodriguez explained. But proving Heritage's involvement in orchestrating violence required evidence of direct communication or coordination. Wang obtained search warrants for Heritage Development's business records and communications. What they found was a sophisticated operation involving multiple criminal conspiracies. Heritage has been running property acquisition scams in 12 neighborhoods across Queens and Brooklyn, Wang reported after reviewing their files. They've forced over 60 families from their homes through orchestrated harassment campaigns. The business model was elegant and profitable. Heritage would identify desirable properties in gentrifying neighborhoods, then systematically destroy community stability through manufactured conflicts between neighbors. They create artificial neighborhood disputes, escalate them to violence and legal problems, then purchase the damaged properties at 20 to 30% below market value, Wang explained. How do they recruit neighbors to participate in harassment? They identify residents with legitimate grievances, property disputes, noise complaints, parking conflicts, then offer to help resolve their problems through community advocacy services. Heritage's community advocacy services were actually training programs for conducting legal harassment of targeted neighbors. They teach recruited neighbors how to maximize psychological pressure while avoiding criminal prosecution, Wang continued. Provide legal advice, financial support, and gradually escalate conflicts toward violence. Mitchell had been recruited through his legitimate boundary dispute with Peterson, then trained and funded to conduct increasingly sophisticated harassment. Heritage probably told Mitchell they were helping him recover his stolen property, Rodriguez speculated. Gradually trained him to escalate pressure until Peterson would be forced to abandon his claim. But Heritage's ultimate goal required both neighbors to be removed, which meant Mitchell was also a target for manipulation. The third set of footprints at the scene of the violent incident suggested Heritage had sent someone to ensure the confrontation escalated beyond what Mitchell and Peterson would have done independently. They needed both neighbors destroyed, not just Peterson, Wang observed. So they orchestrated violence that would incriminate both men. Investigation into the mystery third person led to David Richards, a Heritage Development employee whose job title was Community Relations Coordinator. Richards had a criminal background involving assault and harassment, but had been hired by Heritage specifically for his skills in escalating conflicts while avoiding legal responsibility. Richards specializes in manipulating unstable situations into violence, Wang explained after reviewing his background. He's been involved in at least 6 previous Heritage operations, where neighbor disputes escalated to serious crimes. Security camera footage from nearby houses captured Richards in the area during the time of the violent incident, though not clearly enough to prove his direct involvement. Richards was definitely present during the confrontation, Rodriguez confirmed. But proving he orchestrated the violence requires more evidence. Surveillance of Richards revealed that he was already working on Heritage's next target neighborhood, identifying potential conflicts and recruiting harassers for new property acquisition campaigns. This is ongoing criminal conspiracy involving dozens of families, Wang told the task force. Heritage is systematically destroying communities for profit. The federal prosecutor's office agreed to take the case, recognizing that Heritage Development's activities constituted organized racketeering under federal RICO statutes. This is exactly the kind of systematic criminal enterprise RICO was designed to address, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen explained. Coordinated criminal activity for commercial purposes, involving multiple victims across state lines. But building a RICO case required extensive investigation and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. We need to document Heritage's criminal activities in all affected neighborhoods, identify all victims, and prove the coordinated nature of their operations, Chen continued. Meanwhile, Peterson and Mitchell remained unaware that their conflict had been orchestrated by a criminal organization seeking to steal their properties. "Do we tell them they've been manipulated?" Rodriguez asked. "Not yet," Chen advised. "If they learn about Heritage's involvement, they might interfere with our investigation or attempt retaliation that could compromise the case." Peterson was facing criminal charges for the fence destruction and the weapons violations. Mitchell was cooperating with prosecutors, believing Peterson had spontaneously escalated to violence. "Both men are victims of Heritage's manipulation," Rodriguez observed. "But they'll face legal consequences for crimes they were manipulated into committing." The investigation was expanding to include federal agencies with expertise in organized crime and real estate fraud. What had started as a neighbor dispute was now a major federal case involving systematic community destruction for profit. The federal investigation into Heritage Development Corporation culminated in coordinated raids across 3 states in March 2021. Over 60 Heritage employees and associates were arrested, including executives who had orchestrated systematic community destruction for profit. I was part of the team that arrested David Richards, the community relations coordinator, who had manipulated the Peterson-Mitchell conflict into violence. Richards' apartment contained detailed files on dozens of neighborhood disputes he'd been assigned to escalate. Each file contains psychological profiles of the targets, escalation strategies, and detailed timelines for destroying community stability. Agent Foster explained as we processed Richards' evidence. Richards had been Heritage's specialist in turning legitimate neighbor grievances into criminal harassment campaigns. His methods were sophisticated and ruthlessly effective. Richards would identify residents with real complaints, then gradually train them to escalate conflicts beyond anything they would have done naturally, Foster continued. The evidence showed that Mitchell had been systematically manipulated over 2 years, receiving training in harassment techniques, legal advice for avoiding prosecution, and financial incentives for escalating pressure on Peterson. Mitchell genuinely believed he was defending his property rights, Rodriguez observed after reviewing Richards' manipulation files. Heritage convinced him that extreme measures were justified. But Heritage's manipulation of Mitchell included preparation for his eventual disposal. Once Peterson was driven away, Mitchell would have been targeted for harassment by a new recruited neighbor until he also abandoned his property. Heritage's business model required destroying both neighbors, Agent Foster explained. Mitchell was always intended to be a victim, not a permanent ally. The evidence of Heritage's systematic manipulation provided grounds for dismissing most charges against both Peterson and Mitchell. They were victims of criminal conspiracy rather than independent actors. The prosecutor has agreed to drop charges against Peterson in exchange for his testimony against Heritage, Rodriguez told Peterson during a final interview. Mitchell will also have charges reduced based on evidence of manipulation. Peterson's reaction to learning about Heritage's manipulation was a mixture of relief and horror. "You're telling me that Harold and I were both being used? That our whole conflict was artificial? Heritage identified your legitimate property dispute, then escalated it systematically to force both of you from your homes. Harold was being paid to harass me? Paid, trained, and manipulated. He thought he was defending his rights, but Heritage was using him to steal both your properties. Peterson struggled to process the revelation that his nightmare neighbor experience had been a calculated business operation. So, Harold isn't really a monster? He was just being manipulated like me? Mitchell has a history of property disputes, which made him an ideal candidate for Heritage's recruitment. But the systematic harassment was orchestrated by professionals. The psychological impact of learning about the manipulation was complex for both men. Their hatred for each other had been carefully cultivated by criminals seeking to exploit their conflict. Mitchell's reaction was more difficult. Learning that he'd been manipulated into destroying his neighbor's life as part of a criminal conspiracy shattered his self-image as a righteous property defender. "I thought I was protecting what was mine," Mitchell told Rodriguez during his final interview. "Everything I did, I believed it was justified. Heritage spent 2 years training you to escalate conflicts while believing you were acting independently. The money they paid me, the advice they gave me, the training sessions, I thought they were helping me get justice. They were using you to commit crimes that would eventually destroy both you and Peterson." Mitchell's cooperation with federal prosecutors provided crucial evidence for the RICO case against Heritage Development. His detailed testimony about Heritage's training methods and psychological manipulation techniques helped convict the organization's leadership. The federal trial of Heritage Development executives lasted 4 months and resulted in convictions for racketeering, fraud, conspiracy, and systematic harassment. The company's assets were seized and used to compensate victims of their property acquisition schemes. Vincent Morrison, Heritage's CEO, received 18 years in federal prison for organizing criminal conspiracies that destroyed dozens of communities. David Richards, the manipulation specialist, received 12 years for his role in orchestrating harassment campaigns and violence between neighbors. Anthony Messina, Heritage's legal counsel who had developed methods for staying below prosecution thresholds, received 8 years for conspiracy and advising criminal activities. The conviction sent a message to other development companies using similar tactics, but the damage to affected communities was irreversible. Heritage destroyed neighborhood stability in 12 different areas, Agent Foster observed during the post-trial analysis. Even with the criminal organization dismantled, those communities may never recover. Peterson and Mitchell were offered counseling services to help them process the psychological trauma of their manipulated conflict. Both men struggled with guilt over actions they'd taken while being manipulated. "I destroyed Harold's fence and shot at his house," Peterson said during a joint counseling session. "Even if I was being manipulated, I still chose to escalate to violence. And I terrorized Bill's family for months," Mitchell added. "Manipulation doesn't excuse what I did to innocent people." The counseling focused on helping both men understand how sophisticated psychological manipulation had exploited their legitimate grievances. The case also changed how real estate professionals approach neighborhood conflicts. Industry associations developed protocols for identifying and reporting suspicious patterns that might indicate manipulation by criminal organizations. Heritage's methods were so effective because they exploited genuine grievances while staying below criminal prosecution thresholds, explained Detective Wong during a real estate fraud conference. They turned neighbors into unwitting accomplices in their own property theft. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on Peterson and Mitchell themselves. Both men learned that their most intense personal conflict had been orchestrated by strangers seeking financial gain. The worst part isn't that we were manipulated. Peterson reflected during our final interview. It's that we'll never know which of our feelings were real and which were artificially created. Mitchell expressed similar confusion about distinguishing genuine emotions from manufactured conflict. I felt such rage toward Bill, such certainty that he was stealing from me. Learning that those feelings were deliberately created makes me question everything I think I know about myself. The psychological impact of learning about manipulation was, in many ways, more traumatic than the original conflict. Both men struggled with questions about personal agency and authentic emotion. Dr. Williams explained that this was common among victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation. When someone discovers that their deepest convictions were artificially created, it undermines their basic sense of reality and self-knowledge. 5 years after the Heritage convictions, both Peterson and Mitchell had rebuilt their lives, but remained forever changed by the experience. Peterson sold his house on Hillcrest Drive and moved to New Jersey, closer to his sister's family. He avoided community involvement and maintained minimal contact with neighbors. "I'm probably too suspicious now," Peterson admitted. "But after what happened with Heritage, I can't trust that conflicts are what they appear to be." Mitchell moved to rural Pennsylvania and became involved in victim advocacy, helping other manipulation survivors understand their experiences. "If sharing my story helps other people recognize when they're being manipulated, then maybe some good can come from what I did," Mitchell said. The Heritage development case demonstrated that modern real estate fraud had evolved beyond simple financial scams to include systematic community psychological warfare. Heritage represented a new form of organized crime, Agent Foster concluded in her final report. They weaponized human psychology to steal property through manufactured conflict. The FBI created new task forces specifically focused on investigating organized real estate manipulation schemes. But identifying these operations remained challenging because they exploited legitimate conflicts. The next Heritage might be operating right now in neighborhoods across the country, Foster warned during congressional testimony, manipulating families into destroying each other for profit. Years later, when I respond to neighbor dispute calls, I remember the Peterson-Mitchell case and look for signs of outside manipulation. Most conflicts are genuinely between neighbors, but some hide criminal conspiracies designed to exploit human weakness for profit. The true horror of the Hillcrest Drive case wasn't the violence or property damage. It was the realization that our deepest personal conflicts can be manufactured by strangers who view human suffering as a business opportunity. Peterson and Mitchell thought they were fighting each other over a few feet of land. In reality, they were unknowing participants in a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had perfected the art of turning neighbors into enemies. The boundary war was never really about boundaries. It was about how easily human hatred can be bought, sold, and manufactured by those who understand the profitable business of community destruction. In the end, the most valuable property Heritage stole wasn't land or houses. It was the trust between neighbors, the sense of community safety, and the belief that our conflicts are our own. Those losses proved far more permanent than any property damage, and far more profitable than any real estate acquisition. The watchers had been watching, but they hadn't been watching for the right threats. While Peterson and Mitchell focused on each other, criminals had been manipulating both of them toward mutual destruction. Sometimes the most dangerous property dispute isn't the one between neighbors. It's the one being orchestrated by someone who stands to profit from their conflict. And sometimes the person trying to steal your property isn't the one next door. It's the one you never see coming, because they're too busy making sure you're looking in the wrong direction.